I didn't choose Mount Baker for any special reason. At least, that's what I kept telling myself on the drive up. The old Volkswagen felt lighter than usual, like it wanted the trip more than I did. I'd planned on a quiet solo weekend, nothing extreme, just a break from people, noise, screens, responsibility. I told friends I wanted clean air and empty space. But the truth sat heavier than the camping gear behind me. I wanted silence because silence doesn't argue with you. It doesn't remind you of what you missed or what you're failing to do. Silence just exists. I thought that would be comforting. Wrong. The forest near Mount Baker had a way of holding sound instead of letting it go. It felt as if every noise I made, the crunch of gravel, the slam of my van door, echoed a beat too long. Like something was listening to how I moved, memorizing it. I reached a small pull-off, a little dispersed campsite that wasn't on any map I checked beforehand. Online photos of this area always looked different each time I saw them. Sometimes the trees were closer, sometimes the clearing was shaped wrong, almost like the posts were from entirely different places. But the spot itself was real enough. A ring of stones, a crude wooden bench, a narrow trail disappearing behind a curtain of brush. When I stepped out, a smell drifted through the air. Sharp, metallic, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten, but not enough to place it. I brushed it off as wet earth. The first hour was peaceful. I leveled the Volkswagen, cracked the windows, brewed a cup of instant coffee on a little stove. The forest breeze felt warm on my arms. I even laughed at myself for being paranoid. Then, while unpacking, I noticed footprints on the trail behind the site. One set. Deep impressions. The spacing was strange, too long for a normal gait. But that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was that the prints pointed toward my camp. Not away. I stood there, letting the woods settle around me. Every once in a while, I swear the wind carried a voice, but faint, like someone murmuring into their own sleeve. The trees swayed without rhythm. My phone lost its signal within minutes. I tried not to dwell on the footprints, even though they traced exactly the narrow path behind the campsite, a path that wasn't on any online map. Even though I knew I'd seen it drawn once, faint pencil lines like someone erased it or tried. The sun dipped, the light between the branches thinned into long strands. I set up my folding chair and ate dinner watching the sky bruise into purple. That's when I saw it. A shape just inside the brush, not moving, not hiding either, more like standing there to be seen. I froze. My fork slipped from my hand and hit the gravel with a metallic ring that echoed again one beat too long. The shape didn't step forward, didn't retreat. It just faded somehow, the way shadows shift when a cloud passes overhead. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just a trunk or a knot of branches. But the human outline, shoulders, head was burned into my mind. I waited until full dark before going into the van. I locked the doors, shut the curtains, and tried to convince myself I was safe. The little reading light flickered twice. Just a power quirk, I told myself. Old vans do that. Still, sleep stayed far away. Around midnight, something knocked on the rear panel of the Volkswagen. 3 taps, light, human. I bolted upright so fast my neck snapped with pain. My breath locked in my chest. I stayed completely still, like movement would confirm I was alive and worth trying the door handle. 3 more taps. Exact same rhythm, almost gentle. I slid from my bed and pressed my ear to the wall. The metal was cold, colder than the air inside the van. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then feet shifting in gravel. Slow, deliberate. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, the footsteps drifted off toward the brush. I stayed awake until dawn, hand wrapped around the small hatchet I kept under the bed for emergencies. When daylight finally came, it came wrong. Thin and silver, not gold. I cracked open the sliding door. Nothing disturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had circled the van, except for one small thing I hadn't noticed the day before. A symbol carved into the wooden bench. A circle with a split down the center, like a broken eye. I had seen that symbol before. I couldn't remember where, maybe a forum post, maybe a ranger report someone forwarded to me last year. Something about campers hearing someone walking just behind them. The post had vanished days later, replaced with a 404 that felt too intentional. I shook the memory off and forced myself to move. Staying paranoid inside the Volkswagen would only make things worse. I boiled water for coffee and tried to settle my nerves. Then I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A beat-up Forest Service truck rolled slowly into the clearing. The driver was an older guy with a beard that looked more like a survival tactic than a style choice. He lowered his window and gave me the kind of nod people give when they're working through a list and don't have the energy for conversation. "Everything all right out here?" he asked. His tone wasn't casual. It was careful, like he was trying to measure something inside my answer. "Yeah, just camping. Quiet night." He blinked once, slow. "Did you hear anything strange?" My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Another long pause. Then, "Wind carries weird here," he said. "If you hear someone walking behind you, don't assume they're close." The hair on my arms rose, he added, "and if you see someone between the trees, someone who looks like they're trying to get your attention, look away." His truck radio crackled with static, just a soft hiss at first, then a voice. 2 seconds of garbled syllables, cutting through before collapsing back into white noise. He frowned like he recognized the pattern of the static, not the message. Then he nodded again and put the truck into gear. Just before he left, he said, "Don't follow anything that calls your name. Not up here." Then he drove off, gravel spitting behind his tires. I stood alone again. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. I tried to hike the trail behind the site, more out of stubbornness than curiosity. I made it maybe a quarter mile before everything felt off. The trees were spaced wrong. The trail seemed to loop back toward itself, act like it was folding into a shape the forest didn't naturally grow in. And that smell returned, the metallic one. Stronger this time, like iron heated and cooled too fast. It hit me so suddenly that I stumbled. I turned back toward camp. On the way down, I kept hearing a pattern of footsteps behind me. Light, human, same rhythm as the knock on the van. Whenever I spun around, the path behind me was empty, but the steps always stopped a breath after I did. Exactly 1 beat too long, as if adjusting to my movement. I practically jogged the last stretch. When I stepped back into my campsite, everything looked normal. Except now the symbol on the bench had a second mark beside it. A vertical slash. Fresh. Carved overnight, or while I was on the trail. The metallic smell drifted again. Not from the trees, but from the van. From the open crack of the sliding door I was sure I'd shut. I froze in place. Something had been inside. The sliding door hung open no more than an inch. Just enough to look accidental. Just enough to make me doubt myself. I shut every door the night before. I remembered hearing each latch click, one after the other, like a ritual meant to keep me sane. But the crack in the door said otherwise. I didn't draw closer at first. I just stood, listening. The forest had gone unnaturally still. No wind, no distant birds. Even the usual creak of branches seemed to have been swallowed by something heavier than silence. The Forest Service ranger's words repeated in my head. "The wind carries weird here. Don't follow anything that calls your name." I didn't hear my name. Not yet. But the woods had a way of shaping themselves around your nerves, pressing on the edges of your awareness until you weren't sure where your senses ended and your imagination began. I forced myself toward the van. The metal handle was warm from the morning sun, but the air that drifted out from the darkness inside was colder than the night had been. I inhaled by reflex, and the metallic smell hit me so hard it coated the back of my throat. I slid the door open. Nothing looked disturbed at first. My sleeping bag was still in place. My folding table still locked against the wall. The cabinets were closed. No footprints on the floor. Then I saw the bed, the blanketed, had been pulled down, only a few inches, but enough to expose the pillow, enough to show the faint indentation where a head might have rested. A chill crawled up my spine. I reached toward the blanket to straighten it, but I stopped halfway. Something was wrong. Something in the air, like the moment before a migraine when light sharpens into needles. Static prickled in my ears. A faint hiss, like radio snow. It grew louder the closer I leaned toward the bed, not in the air around me, but inside my skull, like the sound was vibrating against bone instead of traveling through space. I jerked back and slammed the sliding door shut. The static vanished instantly. My pulse hammered in my neck. I stepped away from the van until my back hit the wooden bench with the carved symbol. The fresh slash glared at me. The whole clearing felt different now, as if the forest had taken one deliberate collective step inward while I was distracted. I knew I should leave, pack up, drive down the mountain, forget any of this happened. But something held me there. Not fear, not curiosity, something quieter, like an instinct I didn't fully trust but couldn't ignore. I kept telling myself, just one more hour. Get your bearings. Don't rush and panic. Panic never solves anything. Panic turns the woods into a maze. But the longer I waited, the more I felt the sensation of being watched. Not from one direction, but from 3 or 4, like a semicircle tightening around my camp. I decided to walk to the little overlook I'd passed the day before. A 10-minute stroll toward open air might help me reset. As I stepped onto the gravel road, something caught my eye. A folded sheet of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. No wind. No cars passing. No sign anyone had been here. My breath thinned as I pulled it free. It was a printed map, Mount Baker Recreation Area. The same one I downloaded weeks ago, except this one looked older, grainier. The lines were faint, like it had been photocopied too many times. In the bottom right corner, someone had circled my campsite, but the circle wasn't round. It was the same broken eye symbol. And across the top of the page, barely visible unless you held it to the light, someone had handwritten a phrase, "Behind you is not behind you." I didn't realize I had stepped back until my heel hit something on the ground, a fallen branch. Sharp. I nearly tripped. Every instinct screamed at me to look over my shoulder. I didn't. Instead, I kept my eyes forward and walked, fast but controlled, down the road. The overlook was a short hike across a slope, a clear view of the valley where I could breathe. But the moment I turned off the road and onto the overlook trail, I felt it again. Footsteps behind me, same rhythm as before. Light, human. 3 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause. I didn't turn around. The ranger's warning hammered through me like a second heartbeat. If you hear someone walking behind you, don't assume they're close. The trail curved toward a ridge. I kept my gaze on the sunlight ahead, fighting the urge to glance back. The footsteps changed speed whenever I did. When I slowed, they slowed. When I sped up, they almost whispered across the dirt. When I reached the overlook, I stepped into full sunlight. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, catching my breath as the view opened beneath me. Endless valleys, layered peaks, a distant streak of river reflecting light like a blade. For a moment, the silence felt clean again. Then I saw the man. Down in the trees, maybe 200 yards away, standing absolutely still in a thin beam of light between the branches. He wasn't facing me. He wasn't facing any direction. He stood with his back exposed, but something about the angle was wrong. It looked like his shoulders were turned slightly too far, as if his body was facing away, but his head was angled nearly sideways. I blinked. He moved, not walked, not shifted weight. He reset, like a skipped frame in a video, suddenly angled a few degrees closer. A tremor rippled through my chest. I backed away toward the trail. But the moment I turned, a voice drifted across the overlook. My name. Soft. Familiar. It was my own voice. My throat closed. I whipped around, but the overlook was empty. The man was gone. The woods held their breath as if waiting for me to take the next step. I ran. Branches whipped my arms. Gravel sprayed under my shoes. The footsteps returned behind me, closer now, matching my pace, gaining. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. When the trail met the road, I nearly stumbled into the clearing of my campsite. I skidded to a stop. The Volkswagen's sliding door was open again, wide open this time. Inside, the blanket was pulled back farther, and on the pillow, written in dust from the van's vent, was the same phrase from the map: "Behind you is not behind you." Something moved in the shadows inside the van. Not a shape, not a person. A shift, like darkness bending around an object that wasn't really there. My legs refused to take another step. Then the wind picked up for the first time all day. It didn't sound like normal wind. It sounded like whispering, wordless at first, then forming something soft, slow, almost coaxing. Come back. Come back. I staggered backward toward the bench. The broken eye symbol stared up at me. The smell of iron flooded the clearing again, thick, metallic, wrong. The whispering grew louder, closer, from behind me and from in front of me and from inside the van all at once. Something brushed the back of my neck. A fingertip. Cold, deliberate. I spun around, finally breaking the one rule everyone so far had warned me about. No one was there. But the whispers didn't stop. They moved around me in a circle, a tightening loop, like the forest had learned how I breathed and wanted to mimic the rhythm. Leaves rustled, gravel cracked, the air pulsed with static. Then slowly, as if waiting for me to notice, the trail behind the campsite darkened. Not like a shadow, more like the sun itself refused to touch that stretch of earth anymore. And from inside that darkness, I heard footsteps. Not approaching, retreating, as if something had walked away from me only after I turned to look. The footsteps faded into the darkened trail until they became part of the silence, absorbed by it, claimed by it. I couldn't tell whether the sound was real or a memory replaying inside my skull. The static in my ears dulled, then sharpened again, like a radio fighting through interference. I stepped back toward the Volkswagen, but every instinct screamed not to go inside. The sliding door hung open like a mouth waiting to close around me. The air pouring from it felt colder than before, almost refrigerated. My skin tightened. A thin strand of dust drifted out of the doorway and twisted in the light like smoke. I swallowed hard. I needed to get out of there. Now. I slammed the sliding door shut and circled to the driver's side. My hands fumbled the keys. I dropped them once, cursed under my breath, picked them up with trembling fingers. When I finally jammed the key into the lock, a soft tapping came from the rear of the van. 3 taps, the same rhythm as the night before. But this time the knock didn't come from outside. It came from inside the van. I froze, gripping the door handle with both hands. The metal burned cold against my palms. My breath fogged out in front of me, even though the morning air wasn't nearly cold enough to justify it. Another tap. Closer to the wall. Gentle. Patient. Static filled my ears again, higher pitched now, carrying a faint pattern, almost a tune. I realized then that the knocks weren't random. They were mimicking my heartbeat. Slower, steadier, as if coaxing my pulse into submission. I backed away from the Volkswagen. 10 feet. 15. The forest around me remained still. No wind. No movement. Just the sensation of being watched by something that didn't care about hiding anymore. My mind screamed to leave, just turn around, take the trail down, find another road out. But the ranger's voice surfaced again, crawling up from memory. The wind carries weird here. Don't follow anything that calls your name. There was no safe direction. Even the road felt wrong, too quiet, as if the world beyond the campsite had slipped away while I was distracted. A flicker of motion caught my eye. On the bench, the carved symbol, something new had been added. Not carved this time. Placed. A small object lay in the groove of the wood, a piece of folded fabric, faded, charcoal gray. I recognized the texture immediately. It was a shirt sleeve. Mine. From a shirt I'd left at home, one I hadn't worn in months, one that shouldn't be here. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I reached forward slowly, forcing myself to touch it. The fabric was warm, like someone had held it moments before. A memory flashed, not clear, not complete. The outline of a man standing behind me. A shoulder brushing mine. Breath on the back of my neck. I jerked away from the bench so hard I nearly fell. My mind started to fracture under the weight of too many questions. How long had something been following me? Did it touch me before? Whisper to me before I even arrived? Did I come to this campsite because I chose it, or because something led me here? The Volkswagen door creaked, slowly. Despite being firmly shut, the latch trembled outward, millimeter by millimeter, like a hand easing open a curtain. I didn't wait to see more. I sprinted, not down the trail, not up the road. My feet carried me toward the tree line into dense brush, where the forest grew thick and unforgiving. Rational or not, the woods felt like the only place where I could disappear long enough to plan my next move. Branches slapped my arms, thorns scraped my legs. Every step felt like wading deeper into a place built to confuse me. Trees leaned inward, the ground sloped in uneven ways as if reshaping itself beneath my weight. The footsteps returned somewhere behind me, lighter, quicker this time, not echoing, not chasing, following, matching my pace with precision that felt unnatural. I didn't turn around, not after everything I'd been told, but the footsteps weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me to listen. A voice threaded through the trees, soft, distant, familiar, speaking in a tone I'd heard 1,000 times in my own head. Come back. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken as if calling me in from the porch at the end of a long day. I stumbled over a root and caught myself against a tree. Bark pressed into my palms, my vision blurred. The metallic smell seeped through the forest again, thick and tangible, like I was inhaling rust. Something shifted in the corner of my eye, a figure, not close, not far, standing between two trees like a shadow that forgot how to blend in. I forced myself not to look directly at it, not yet. My body shook with the effort. Instead, I kept walking, moving sideways along the slope, trying to circle back toward the road without revealing my intentions. The figure didn't advance. It just waited, like a landmark of a place I didn't want to return to. The static in my ears sharpened. Then, faintly, I recognized the pattern. 3 short bursts, too long, a repeat, Morse code, or something pretending to be. I didn't know the letters, but I understood the rhythm. It was tapping with the footsteps, communicating, calling. I reached a break in the trees and saw a narrow strip of road below. If I could get there, maybe I could flag down a car or find a service pullout for a distress call. I slid down the slope, grabbing roots and stones, moving too quickly to care about cuts and scrapes. The road came into view, and so did another shape, standing dead center on the asphalt, facing away from me, shoulders too still, head angled slightly to the right, like it had heard me but didn't want to reveal it. I crouched low, heart battering against my ribs. My breath trembled. The figure didn't move, but the longer I stared, the more something inside me twisted, a fragment of memory, a feeling. I'd seen that posture before, not here, at home, in the reflection on a dark window when I thought I was alone. I blinked, and the figure blinked too. Not a turn of the head. A blink, a closing of eyes on a face I couldn't see. My entire body froze. The thing on the road lifted its hand, slowly, palm outward, not waving, showing me something. A familiar shape, a circle, a split down the center, the broken eye symbol, etched into its palm. My legs nearly buckled. I grabbed a tree trunk and dragged myself backward into the brush before it could fully raise its arm. The smell of metal surged again, clogging my lungs. Leaves rustled behind me. Footsteps. Too close. I pushed through the brush, stumbling toward a thicker cluster of trees. The static turned into a roar. My name echoed once, not from ahead or behind, but from inside my head, spoken in my own voice with perfect clarity. Then, something touched my shoulder. Not a grab, a tap. 3 taps. The same gentle rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat. I whipped around despite every warning I'd been given. No one stood there. But the air shimmered, like heat distortion, but cold, not warm. A faint outline flickered, as if something was trying to become visible but couldn't hold its shape. The distortion leaned forward and whispered, "Come back." The temperature around me dropped so suddenly that my breath frosted. I turned and ran deeper into the forest, not caring where the trail was, not caring about anything except getting distance between me and that shifting outline. Branches tore at me. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision. My lungs burned. Then abruptly, the ground leveled out. A clearing, and in the center, my Volkswagen, parked neat, doors closed, as if it had always been there, as if I'd never left. My stomach lurched. I looked behind me. The forest was still, silent, waiting. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the Volkswagen like it was a photograph of my own life instead of the real thing. The air around it felt wrong, warmer than the forest behind me, almost humming, as if the van were plugged into something I couldn't see. The doors were all shut again. No signs of disturbance, no footprints on the ground, except mine. For a moment, I wondered if I'd lost time, if I'd run in circles so frantically that I ended up right back where I started without noticing. But the forest didn't feel like it had looped. It felt like it had guided me, or returned me, like whatever lived out there didn't want me to leave. I backed away slowly, keeping the van in my peripheral vision. The clearing was quiet again, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest until you can hear your heartbeat in your teeth. Then, click, the sliding door unlocked, not opened, unlocked. Soft, precise, deliberate. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. The sun shifted overhead, warming my face, but the rest of me felt cold. Something brushed the back of my mind, like a half-forgotten memory rising through murky water. A night last year, camping in Washington. Waking up convinced someone stood behind me in the dark, only to find nothing when I turned. The smell of metal in the air. Static in my ears. A dream, I'd told myself. Stress. But now I wasn't sure. What if the man behind me that night wasn't a dream? What if it had been this? The thought made my knees tremble. I forced myself toward the van, inch by inch. I needed the keys to leave. They were still in my pocket, but panic had shoved them deep, twisted the ring sideways. My fingers dug desperately, searching, slipping. A soft creak came from the van. I froze. The sliding door eased open, only a few inches back, like it was reacting to my fear, like it was aware of me. Stop! I whispered before I could stop myself, my voice shaking. The door stopped moving. The forest held its breath. I didn't know what terrified me more, the idea that something inside the van had obeyed, or the idea that the van itself had. I swallowed and forced my hand back into my pocket, yanking free the keys. The metal jingled too loudly in the silence. My breath came fast, shallow. I stepped closer. A faint smell floated from the cracked door. Not the metallic scent. Something else, something I couldn't place. It reminded me of... Wait. I sniffed again. Cedar, but sharper, like cedar soaked through with cold water and smoke. I shivered at the familiarity, but couldn't place the memory. The door slid another inch, smooth, fluid, like someone guiding it with fingertips. I took one more step, leaning forward just enough to see into the van. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. The sleeping bag neatly rolled, the pillow flattened from use, the cabinet doors shut. But something was wrong about the shadows. They didn't fall where they should. The angle was off. The darkness pooled in the wrong places, like the light refused to enter certain corners. Static buzzed faintly, rising like a warning. I reached forward to shut the door completely. Something inside the van whispered my name. Not spoken, not breathed. Whispered like the sound rode in on a vibration passing straight through the metal. I stumbled back so fast I nearly dropped the keys. The whisper came again. Same tone, same cadence, quiet, coaxing. Come back. The exact phrase I'd heard in the forest. My pulse hammered in my neck. I backed toward the tree line without meaning to, every instinct pulling me away from the van. Then the pillow shifted. Just a crease. Just a subtle movement, like something beneath it had exhaled. My vision blurred at the edges. Panic burned up my throat. Stay away, I choked out, though I wasn't talking to anything specific, just to the air, the forest, the van, whatever stood behind the thin membrane of reality vibrating in front of me. The whisper faded, but something else replaced it, a soft rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. Not from the van. Behind me. I whipped around, and I wasn't alone. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadow of a cedar. At least, his shape resembled a man. But his posture was too still, his limbs too even, like someone wearing the idea of a person rather than the real thing. He faced away from me, back exposed, head slightly turned like he was listening to something behind him, or behind me. A cold wind blew from his direction, carrying that sharp cedar smell, the one I couldn't place earlier. Then it hit me. The smell wasn't cedar. It was the scent of old, wet wood. The kind you find in cabins abandoned decades ago, places that shouldn't have voices left in them. My breath trembled. The man didn't move. not even to breathe. But something about the angle of his head made me think he knew exactly where I stood. He lifted one hand, slowly, palm outward. At first I thought he was showing me the symbol again, but the palm was blank, empty. Instead, he began to point, not at me, at the forest behind me. My stomach twisted. Every nerve in my body told me not to turn around, not again, not after everything. But the static sharpened, needling into my skull, pushing me from the inside. I turned. The Volkswagen's sliding door was wide open, and inside, a figure sat on the edge of the bed. Not the shadow, not the shifting outline. A person. A man in a dark gray jacket, elbows resting on his knees, hands hanging loosely. His posture was familiar, painfully familiar. My throat closed. He looked like me. Not exactly. Not a copy, not a twin. But enough that my mind flinched at the resemblance, like seeing a reflection that wasn't synced with your movements. He raised his head, and I felt something tear inside me, not physically, but deeper, like a thread pulling tight between two versions of myself. His eyes were wrong, dark, unfocused, like he was seeing everything and nothing at the same time. He opened his mouth as if to speak. Static roared in my ears. He whispered, "Behind you is not behind you." My knees buckled. I dropped to the dirt, shaking uncontrollably. When I looked up again, the man inside the van was gone. The man by the cedar was gone. The forest hummed with a low vibration, like the aftershock of something passing through. The only thing left moving was the sliding door, gently swaying, as if someone had just walked through it, or walked out of it. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold the keys. I didn't think. I lunged to the driver's door, jammed the key into the lock, and threw myself inside. My breath came in ragged bursts. The van interior felt wrong, too cramped, too cold, like someone else had been sitting there seconds before me. Something brushed the back of my seat. I didn't look. I turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice. Static filled the cabin. The smell of metal thickened, and then the van started. I slammed it into gear and sped down the mountain road so fast the tires spit gravel behind me like gunshots. But halfway down the first switchback, something made my stomach twist. In the side mirror, for a split second, I saw a man sitting in the back seat, head down, hands folded, as if he'd been waiting the whole time. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until the cold hit my lungs, so cold it felt wrong, as if the temperature inside my own chest had dropped 10 degrees. I stayed crouched behind the kitchenette, listening. The Volkswagen's interior creaked, a small settling sound, like someone shifting their weight against the opposite wall. I waited. Nothing. Just the faint hum of wind sliding down through the pines, and that thin, static-like hiss that had followed me since the trail junction. It had never been this loud. It crawled along the metal shell of the van, like interference brushing against aluminum. I stood slowly, careful not to bump anything, and reached for the blackout curtain I'd hung behind the driver's seat. My fingers were shaking so hard I brushed the fabric twice before I finally gripped it and pulled it back an inch. The headlights, still pointed toward the tree line, lit up only fog. White, low fog I hadn't seen before, but shapes moved inside it, just barely, just enough to make my stomach fold in on itself. A figure leaned forward out of the fog. I didn't see his face, just the outline. Shoulders. A head tilted at an angle that made my teeth ache to look at. He wasn't close, maybe 20 feet away, but he was facing the van, facing me. I let the curtain fall back into place. My hands were numb. The static hiss on the roof sharpened, almost precise, like tiny footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just pine needles blown across the metal, but the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. I could count the steps. 5. Pause. Thraw. Pause. Scrape. The scrape came from the passenger side door, low, like someone dragging a finger under the frame, just hard enough to test whether it would lift. The memory hit me out of nowhere. Something from months back, something I hadn't thought about since leaving the desert. A park ranger outside Sedona, leaning into my window, saying in a voice he didn't want written down, "If you ever hear scraping near your rig, don't answer it. Something learned we come to sounds." At the time, I thought he was talking about coyotes or maybe desperate people living in the canyons. He wouldn't explain. He just stepped back and said, "Keep the lights off and don't talk to it." I had laughed it off. Now all the air left my body at once. The scrape came again, a little higher this time, like the fingertip, or whatever it was, tracing the seam between the door and the metal frame. I backed away from the door, reached for the flashlight, thought better of it, grabbed the crank window handle instead, and locked it down tight. The scrape stopped. The static didn't. It moved across the roof now toward the driver's side, like whoever, or whatever, had been pacing the tree line was now pacing the top of the Volkswagen. I pressed my hand against the inside of the paneling. Cold seeped through immediately. The shape outside hadn't moved the last time I'd seen it, but now a shadow fell across the curtains. It stretched long, distorted by the headlights, but it blocked the fog behind it. Someone was standing just on the other side of the glass. The urge to speak flared in me. Some stupid instinct to say, "Who's there?" as if that question would break the spell, as if a simple explanation would step out of the dark and make everything normal again. But the ranger's warning crawled through my skull. Don't talk to it. I bit the inside of my cheek and stayed still. The shadow didn't move. The static stopped. For just a second, everything stopped. Wind, sound, even the faint hum of the Volkswagen's battery. The air thinned until I was sure I was hearing something beneath the silence. Breathing, not mine. Slow, unhurried, close. My eyes watered as I tried to stay quiet. Something brushed against the driver's door just once, a soft, almost polite knock. It mimicked human rhythm. 3 taps, then 1, then nothing. Another buried memory surfaced, a blog post I'd read years back, something on a forum dedicated to off-grid camping. A man up near Mount Liking at Baker wrote about a tapping pattern at his camper door. He said he'd recorded the sound and uploaded the video. I'd clicked the link. It had already been removed. File no longer exists, possibly deleted by user. But someone in the comments said tapping was how it learned your timing, how long it took you to move, how fast you breathed. The shadow outside shifted, shrinking slightly, lowering, like it was bending down, like it was listening through the gap under the door. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to control my breathing, trying not to give anything away. The headlights flickered, dimmed, then surged back just enough to cast a long, warped silhouette against the curtain, too long for one person. I blinked hard, trying to clear my eyes, but the shape didn't change. Then the fog blew in, thick and sudden, wiping out the shadow entirely. For 1 second, I thought it had gone. Then a new sound bloomed beneath the van, vibrating up through the metal floor, a low hum. Almost a voice, almost a word. My name, not exact, not really spoken, but close enough that every hair on my body rose at once. I staggered backward, hit the small built-in cabinet behind the bed platform, and something fell out. A map I'd bought earlier that day from the Glacier Ranger Station. It unfolded halfway across the floor. My stomach knotted tighter than anything before, because the trail I'd taken, the spur that led to this exact campsite, wasn't on the map. Not faint, not mislabeled. Gone, as if it had never existed. I crawled toward it, my fingers shaking as I traced the printed lines. The ridge I'd followed earlier wasn't there. The clearing wasn't there. The road I'd turned off from wasn't marked at all. As I stared at the map, I realized the fog outside was getting brighter, like someone was shining a white light directly into it from the tree line. A silhouette stepped into that light, the same one from earlier. Only now I could see more detail. The angle of the head wasn't human. The posture was wrong, tilted forward, as if it balanced its weight from the hips instead of the legs. Something hung from its hand, something small, something swinging. A set of keys. My keys. The Volkswagen keys I had left in the ignition. The figure raised its head a fraction, and my body reacted before my mind did. My hands scrambled behind me, grabbing the toolbox and wrenching it open. I didn't even know what I was looking for. I'm not proud of what I grabbed. A hammer. It felt stupid in my hand, too small, too human for whatever was outside. The fog pulsed again, and the silhouette drifted closer, not walking but shifting, as if each movement was a correction rather than a step. My breath scattered in shards. My heart felt like it was tearing at the inside of my ribs. The ground under the Volkswagen rumbled softly. The static on the roof sharpened into a single needle-thin point directly above me. I snapped. I hit the light switch. The interior lit up. Yellow, warm, too sudden. And the shadow outside flinched backward, like it wasn't used to the light. The keys clattered to the ground. I grabbed the ignition key through the window gap. I didn't even remember rolling it down, and twisted hard. The Volkswagen coughed, sputtered, then roared awake with a backfire like a gunshot. The shadow jerked, almost recoiling. I slammed the van into reverse, tires spinning in the wet soil, rocks spraying across the campsite, fog splitting around me as the headlights tore through it. Something ran alongside the van, fast, faster than I could track. A smear of black against the glass, a shape that angled its head toward the window as I sped backward down the narrow path. I didn't look at its face. I couldn't. If I had, I don't think I'd be writing this now. Branches scraped the sides of the Volkswagen, snapping and bending as I pushed the old bus harder than I ever had before. The road, if it was even a road, dipped and veered, and several times the tires lost traction entirely. But I kept going until the fog thinned, until the trees opened up, until the faint glow of Highway 542 appeared like a vein of safety through the dark. I didn't stop driving for 2 hours. Not until I reached a gas station in Maple Falls. Not until people were around me. Even then, I didn't sleep. And something else. When I finally stepped out and slammed the driver's door shut, I heard something shift inside the door panel. Something small. Something that slid down with a soft, familiar jingle. I opened the panel with shaking fingers. A single key fell out. Not mine. A campsite key tag from Arizona. A place I hadn't visited in years. A place where once I'd heard tapping on my camper door in the middle of the night. 3 taps, then 1. I left the key on the ground and drove until the sun came up. I haven't been back to Mount Baker, but some nights when it's quiet, when the air feels just a little too cold, I hear that static hiss again. And I don't turn around to see if anything is standing behind me, because I already know. I learned a long time ago that you can tell a lot about a place by what people abandon there. And out in the forgotten corners of America's campgrounds, those old Volkswagen pullouts half swallowed by moss and time, the things left behind never really stay quiet. They linger the way a warning does, faint at first, easy to ignore, until you finally understand it was meant for you all along. My name is Adrian Burke. I'm 37 now. And most of my life has been spent chasing open roads in a faded green Volkswagen Westphalia I rebuilt with my own hands. I grew up thinking abandoned campgrounds were just failed projects, funding gone wrong, land disputes, places people stopped caring about. But the more nights I spent parked in the wrong places, the more I learned that some campgrounds weren't abandoned because people forgot them. Some were abandoned because people were trying to forget what happened there. The first time I truly understood that was last fall, out in the high desert of eastern Utah. I had been driving for hours through badlands that folded into themselves like broken knuckles. Empty. Quiet. Too quiet for the wind that should have been moving through the cracks. I remember feeling a kind of stillness in the air, a tightness I couldn't name yet, but I kept pushing forward. I told myself I wasn't tired, that I wasn't chasing anything, that I wasn't running from the memories I never talk about, but unease has a way of recognizing you before you recognize it. I had been aiming for a marked campground on an old map, one of those outdated pamphlet charts printed when Volkswagen still rolled off the line with manual windows and a stubborn choke. When I reached the area where the campground should have been, I found nothing but a rusted chain across a sun-bleached road and a collapsed wooden sign face down in the dust. The lettering was long gone, peeled and lifted by years of storms, but there was enough of the outline to guess what it used to say: Clearwater Bluff Campground. I stepped out of the van, the heat shifting like a sheet over my back, and I remember thinking how strange it felt that the world was absolutely still. No insects, no birds, no wind brushing through the sagebrush, just that chain swaying slightly, as if someone had walked away from it moments before I arrived. Most people would have turned around. But I've never been good at listening to the quiet voice that tells you something's wrong. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's denial disguised as courage. Or maybe deep down, I wanted to feel something other than the numbness I'd been dragging across state lines for months. So I stepped over the chain, got back into my Volkswagen, and drove slowly down the cracked path toward the abandoned campground. The road wound through cliffs, the color of dried blood, carved by time and forgotten promises. The farther I went, the more I felt the temperature change. Not colder, not warmer, just different, like the air was thicker, heavier, charged with a static you couldn't feel until it settled beneath your skin. My headlights brushed across old wooden posts marking campsites, half-rotted and leaning at awkward angles, fire rings filled with stones that had never cooled evenly, shadows where tents once stood. And then the first sign something was truly wrong. A Volkswagen hubcap, polished unnaturally clean, resting upright in the dirt as if someone had placed it there just seconds ago. I stopped the van. My breath slowed. The desert was still empty, or at least it looked empty. I got out and crouched beside the hubcap. The metal wasn't just clean, it was cold. Ice cold, despite the heat rolling off the canyon walls around me. I pulled my hand back, shaken, and scanned the ground for tracks, for any hint of recent activity. Nothing. Not even my own footprints seemed to settle right. The sand shifted as if resisting the shape of my boots. I should have left then, anyone reasonable would have. But reason is a thin rope when curiosity starts pulling harder than fear. The sun dipped below the cliffs as I drove deeper into the campground. My van's beams cut through the rising darkness, illuminating abandoned picnic tables, overturned chairs, and the faint remains of chalk markings on a slab of concrete. Hopscotch squares drawn by a child who must be grown now, wherever they are, whoever they became after they left this place behind. Eventually, I found a flat spot near what used to be the campground's central loop. My van idled with a low, steady growl that seemed too loud for the stillness around me. I felt exposed, like the silence was studying me, memorizing me, waiting for me to shut the engine off. When I finally did, the sudden quiet slammed into me so fast it stole the breath from my lungs. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute, listening. Nothing. Not even the ticking of cooling metal. The Volkswagen felt alive in every campground I'd ever visited, creaking, settling, humming faintly even after the engine stopped. But here it felt like it, too, was holding still. I tried the radio for comfort. Static. Not the usual soft hiss. This was harsh, jagged, like it was picking up fragments of something it shouldn't. A distant clicking. A faint rhythm. Like someone tapping metal against metal in a slow, deliberate pattern. I shut it off, but the tapping didn't stop. It was faint, coming from outside, maybe 20 or 30 feet behind the van. I turned in my seat, staring out the rear window into the dark. My breath fogged the glass. I wiped it with my sleeve. The darkness stared back, unmoving. When the tapping happened again, it had shifted, closer, maybe 10 feet away. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it wasn't even threatening. It was measured, intentional, like someone wanted me to know they were there but didn't want to scare me, yet. A cold wave crawled up my spine. Every instinct screamed to drive away, but I stayed frozen, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. I told myself it was just metal contracting in the cooling air, that abandoned campgrounds echo in weird ways, that I was projecting tension onto nothing. But I knew better. The tapping stopped, the silence deepened. And then I heard a sound that didn't belong to nature or machinery or the shifting desert. A long, slow exhale, soft, raspy human, right behind the van. My throat tightened. I locked the doors without looking away from the rear window, my finger trembling as it pressed the button. My mind raced through 100 possibilities. A drifter, A stranded camper, someone hiding out here for reasons I didn't want to understand, or something that had never been human in the first place. I leaned forward just enough to reach the light switch. My hand hovered, shaking. But before I could turn on the interior lights, something scraped gently along the metal panel of the van's rear hatch. Not claws, not a tool, fingers, slow, dragging fingers. The kind of touch that says, "I already found you." The fingers trailed along the back of my van with the gentleness of someone testing a boundary, like whatever was out there wanted to feel the shape of me before revealing its intention. The sound was so subtle that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it, if fear had finally begun to sculpt noises out of nothing. But then the touch came again, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, and the metal vibrated so faintly I felt it through the driver's seat. My breath stalled. I didn't dare move. My mind tried to assemble the safest explanation possible. Someone lost, someone harmless, someone who needed help. But the desert air carried no scent of another person, no shuffle of shoes, no breath pattern that matched a living human being, only that quiet, unnatural scrape. I forced myself to inhale. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if the entire campground had shifted a fraction of an inch closer. I reached slowly toward the flashlight stored beside the seat. Every inch of movement felt reckless, like lifting a hand in the presence of a sleeping animal you hoped wouldn't wake. My fingers brushed the flashlight's grip. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then a hollow tap. Just one sounded near the van's rear bumper. Not like knuckles. More like someone tapping a nail against the metal. Slow. Testing. As though confirming exactly where I was sitting. I tightened my grip around the flashlight but didn't turn it on. Light suddenly burst into darkness can do two things: reveal something awful, or reveal that something awful is standing closer than you thought. I wasn't sure which outcome terrified me more. The tapping resumed, this time in a pattern that felt eerily rhythmic. 2 taps, a pause, 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps again. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the shifting heat of old metal. It felt like communication, intentional, persistent, patient. I swallowed hard. Who's there? My own voice sounded too loud, too thin, like it didn't belong to me anymore. The words sat in the air and went nowhere. No answer, no movement, but the tapping stopped again. A different sound followed, something brushing through the dry sagebrush, something dragging lightly across the ground. It circled the van in slow arcs, footsteps that weren't quite footsteps, a gait that didn't seem fully committed to the earth beneath it. Then came the soft crunching sound near the picnic table behind me. Something had stepped onto wood, but the weight didn't match a person. Too light, too careful. I felt watched, not from a distance, but from the edge of the glass, as if a presence hovered inches outside my window. I forced myself to lift my head just enough to see the side mirror. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of abandoned campground, moonlight pooling in the spaces where memories once lived. Fire rings that had not been used in years. A tattered American flag on a pole, missing half its stripes, unmoving in wind that no longer existed. Then the mirror shifted. Not much, just a subtle tremor, a vibration you would feel if someone brushed it with their fingertips. The mirror angled inward by a hair, enough to reveal that I wasn't imagining it, enough to confirm that something stood close enough to touch it. I turned forward again, gripping the steering wheel to stop my hands from shaking. My heart hammered so violently I thought whatever was out there would hear it, would interpret it as fear, would take it as permission. I needed to move. I knew that. Staying still felt like surrendering to whatever was studying me through the glass. I turned the key, praying the Volkswagen's old engine wouldn't hesitate. For once, the van cooperated. The moment the starter whirred, whatever circled me fell completely silent, as if surprised. Then, all at once, the tapping erupted again, louder, faster, all across the rear panel. Not one set of fingers now. Many. As if a dozen hands trailed along the metal at once, trying to hold on, trying to keep me there. I slammed the van into drive, tires spitting dust. The van lurched forward, but the tapping didn't fade. It followed, skittering across the metal like insects trying to crawl inside. My breath locked in my throat as I accelerated toward the broken path leading out of the campground. The headlights flashed across something in the road. My stomach flipped. A second Volkswagen hubcap, identical to the first, upright, clean, waiting. I swerved around it, but the sight of it cut through me like ice. Someone, or something, was placing them deliberately, curating them, leaving them like breadcrumbs or trophies. As I reached the chain that marked the boundary of Clearwater Bluff, the tapping finally stopped. Completely. The shift was so sudden, the silence felt violent. My ears rang. My hands shook so hard I almost lost control of the wheel. But I didn't stop driving. Not until the chain was a shrinking shadow in my rearview mirror. Not until the cliffs softened into rolling dark shapes behind me. Not until the night wind finally found the desert again and carried sound back into the world. When I finally pulled off the road miles later, my heartbeat still hadn't steadied. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, hands trembling in my lap. The van ticked softly now, returning to its normal warmth, as if nothing had happened. I needed air. I stepped outside. The world felt different, alive again. Crickets chirped. A faint breeze brushed across my neck. The desert smelled like sage and dust instead of the cold metallic tang that clung to the abandoned campground. The normalcy made me question everything. Had fear twisted shadows into shapes? Had solitude sculpted noises out of emptiness? I leaned against the van, staring into the night sky that stretched infinitely overhead. Stars spilled across it in a slow cascade. The vastness made me feel small, but it was a comforting kind of small. Not the way Clearwater Bluff had made me feel, like I didn't belong there at all. Still, something nagged at me, a thread of dread woven into the back of my mind. I told myself it was just adrenaline. That once morning came, I'd laugh at how tightly I'd gripped the wheel, that the human mind plays tricks when it's tired and alone. But adrenaline doesn't explain everything, because when I walked around to the back of the van to check for damage, I froze. There were prints on the metal. Not fingerprints, not handprints. They looked like smears, long and thin, as if something with too many joints dragged its limbs along the surface before letting go. The smears were faint, almost invisible unless you angled the van just right under the moonlight. But once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. Worse, they were warm. The desert night had cooled the van everywhere else. Every inch of metal felt cold under my hand except where those smears were. That patch of metal pulsed with warmth, like something alive had pressed against it. My chest tightened. I backed away. Something came out of that abandoned campground with me. Or maybe it never needed to leave, because maybe it had already been waiting in my van long before I realized anything was wrong. The thought slid through my mind before I could stop it. I looked through the rear window. For a moment, I swore I saw movement, just a shift in shadow, a suggestion of something pulling back behind the folded bedding. I blinked. Nothing. Just darkness. Still, I didn't get back inside immediately. I stood there for far too long, staring, convincing myself that if something had come with me, I would have seen it clearly. That shadows were just shadows. That trauma from old memories I tried not to revisit was pushing itself forward through moments of weakness. Eventually, though, the chill returned. Not from fear, but from the night air settling on my skin. Reluctantly, I opened the sliding door, climbed into the van, and latched it behind me. The interior smelled normal. Old upholstery, pine cleaner, dust. Nothing strange, nothing wrong. But as I lay back and pulled my sleeping bag over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the van felt slightly fuller, as if it wasn't just me breathing inside it anymore. That feeling stayed with me long after I settled beneath the thin blanket. A quiet awareness, a pressure, like the van was holding its breath in sync with mine. I stared into the darkness above me, waiting for my eyes to adjust, waiting for rationality to catch up and smother the fear rising beneath my ribs. But the silence hung in the air like a thick curtain, and every small sound inside the Volkswagen, cloth settling, wood creaking, the faint tick of cooling metal, felt amplified, too intentional. Sleep, didn't come easily. When it did, it felt less like drifting off and more like slipping under ice. I woke to a sound so soft it almost dissolved the moment I opened my eyes. A breath. Not mine. It came from the foot of the bed, just past the worn edge of the sleeping bag. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle locked, unsure if I was awake or trapped in the tail end of a dream. The van was dark, so dark that I couldn't make out more than shapes, but I knew the layout intimately. The counter on the left, the cabinet door that never stayed fully shut, the small space of floor near my boots, a faint shift of weight pressed against that floor. Slow, methodical. A presence adjusting itself, trying not to make a sound but failing just enough to reveal that it was there, and had been for a while. I didn't move. Couldn't. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal, a hallucination, someone hiding in the van, each explanation worse than the last. I forced my breath to remain steady, hoping that if whatever was there believed I was asleep, it might stay still long enough for me to figure out what to do. But then something brushed the toe of my boot. Just a feather-light touch, as if tracing the shape of my foot through the fabric. A wave of cold rushed up my leg so violently I nearly gasped. I swallowed hard, biting the inside of my cheek until the metallic taste of blood grounded me. I slid my hand beneath the pillow slowly, inch by inch, until my fingers found the cold metal of the flashlight. The touch came again, higher this time, along the side of the sleeping bag, like it was feeling the length of my body. I tightened my grip around the flashlight. The fear wasn't loud or panicked. It was sharp and clear, the kind that removes hesitation. When the touch reached just above my knee, I flicked the flashlight on and swung it downward. But the beam didn't land where I expected. It didn't illuminate a figure crouched near my feet. It didn't reveal an animal or an intruder or any visible shape at all. Instead, the light flooded an empty floor, completely empty. For a moment, confusion overpowered fear. The sound, the pressure, the touch, none of it made sense. I leaned forward, sweeping the beam slowly across every inch of the interior, checking corners, the cabinet, beneath the bedding. Nothing. Just the same cramped, familiar space. But the air still felt disturbed, like motion had happened only seconds before. Then the flashlight flickered. Not because the battery was dying. I had charged it fully the day before. It flickered in a pattern, a pulse, like something was interfering with it. I tapped its casing. It steadied. But the moment it did, a faint knocking came from outside the van. Not behind it this time. From the roof. 3 gentle taps, spaced evenly apart. I aimed the flashlight upward instinctively, even though the roof was solid metal. My heart hammered so hard it shook my vision. The knocking came again, closer now, right above where my chest was. Tap, tap, tap. Each one felt like the echo of a thought forming in an unseen mind. I didn't know what to do. Going outside felt suicidal, but staying inside felt like I was letting the fear crawl deeper into a space that had always been mine, a space I trusted more than most people. The van had carried me through storms, deserts, freezing nights. It wasn't supposed to feel like a trap. I pressed my palm flat against the roof. The metal was cold everywhere, except one circular spot about the size of a hand. That place pulsed faintly with warmth. The tapping stopped. Silence dropped over the van once again, heavy and absolute. I listened for minutes, maybe longer, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back down, not into rest, but into a dull, hovering state between sleep and hyper-awareness. When morning finally came, pale and reluctant, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The desert outside was washed in soft gold, warming the rocks and sagebrush. The world looked normal again, safe even. Birds chirped. The wind carried the sharp scent of juniper. The environment had life again, sound again, motion again. None of the stillness from Clearwater Bluff lingered here, but I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. I climbed out of the van and walked a slow lap around it. I needed proof that the night hadn't been my mind unraveling. I got it. On the roof, faint but visible, were 3 small dents, perfectly spaced, perfectly round, matching the knocks I'd heard. I reached out and touched the metal. The surface was cool now, but the memory of warmth lingered in my fingertips. I traced the dents, feeling the depth of each one, the precision. They weren't caused by falling debris or hail. They weren't random. Something had tapped the roof with a controlled, deliberate touch, soft enough not to damage the structure, firm enough to leave a memory behind. A warning, a greeting, a message. I didn't know which. And part of me didn't want to. I packed the van carefully, checking every compartment twice, not because I expected to find anything inside, but because the fear of missing something felt worse. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition, the engine rumbled with its familiar, comforting growl. That sound steadied me better than anything else. I drove. Not quickly. Not running. Just putting distance between myself and the silent stretch of road where the night had tried to follow me. The miles passed quietly. Towns faded into the horizon. Gas stations came and went. By afternoon, I found myself near an old state route lined with cottonwoods, their leaves shimmering silver in the wind like warning flags. I should have pulled into a proper campground or found a motel, somewhere with people, lights, noise, anything but another isolated patch of land. But isolation was a habit I'd learned too well. I found a turnout beside a dried creek bed and parked beneath a sprawling cottonwood that creaked softly, harmlessly. It felt like a safe place to breathe, to shake the weight of the night from my bones. I slid my door open and stepped out, stretching stiff muscles. The air was warm, bright, forgiving. I sat at a weathered picnic table and watched the road for a long time. That was when I noticed something lying in the dirt near my front tire. Round, metallic, reflective. My stomach dropped. A Volkswagen hubcap, not one of mine. I checked immediately. Both my front hubcaps were still attached firmly. This one was identical to the ones at Clearwater Bluff, polished too perfectly, placed too deliberately. I crouched slowly, my throat tightening as I reached for it. My fingers stopped just shy of touching the metal. Footprints surrounded it. Not human, not animal. Long, narrow impressions with too many joints and a dragging stride, as though the limbs that made them weren't used to carrying weight. They circled the hubcap once, twice, then stopped right at the driver's door. My door. The prints ended there. The realization punched through me. Whatever had left those prints had stood inches from where I slept last night, and it had followed me across the desert. I stumbled back from the hubcap, scanning the tree line, the road, the shadow beneath the picnic table. The cottonwood branches whispered overhead, but nothing moved. Nothing revealed itself, but the evidence remained. Clearer than ever. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't misinterpreting old sounds or shadows. Whatever lived in that abandoned campground wasn't bound to it. It had chosen me, and now it wanted something. I backed toward the van slowly, keeping my eyes on the footprints as if they might rearrange themselves the moment I looked away. The desert wind shifted, sending loose dust skittering over them, softening their edges, but not enough to erase their shape. They were too wrong to dismiss, too distinct, too intentional. Something had stood at my door. Something had followed me. Something wanted me to know it could reach me anywhere. I opened the sliding door and stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind me. The van, usually a sanctuary, felt smaller now, its walls too close, the air too still. I locked every door, an action that felt symbolic more than functional, and rested my forehead against the cool metal for a moment. I needed to think. I needed to breathe. But every inhale tasted faintly metallic, like the abandoned campground had left its residue inside me. The memory of the warm smears on the van, the tapping on the roof, the hubcaps placed with unnatural precision, they all stacked inside my chest, pushing against the veneer of rationality I tried desperately to hold on to. My instinct told me to keep moving. So I drove. Not quickly. Quick meant panicked, and panic would cloud what little clarity I had left. But I drove steadily, putting mile after mile behind me, letting the road unravel into something familiar. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, not expecting to see anything but unable to stop looking. Every mile marker felt like a heartbeat, Every shift in wind felt like a whisper trying to reach me through the glass. After nearly an hour, the tightness in my chest began to loosen. The horizon widened. The desert returned to its indifferent quiet. I told myself I had created a psychological echo, that fear has a way of following even when the threat doesn't. But fear wasn't what made my hands tighten around the steering wheel as I turned onto a forest road leading toward an old rest stop marked on my map. It was the smell. A faint, cold scent drifting through the vents. Metallic, like chilled iron, like something left behind, waiting to be found again. The road narrowed as I entered the woods. Tall pines closed in overhead, weaving shadows across the pavement. The air grew cooler, more humid, carrying the scent of pine sap and soil, and beneath it, that metallic tang lingering like a question I didn't want answered. The rest stop appeared around a bend, a cracked asphalt loop surrounding an old stone picnic shelter and a faded bulletin board whose notices were bleached beyond recognition. A single lamppost stood beside it, crooked, its bulb long dead. A place people forgot existed. A place something could wait undisturbed. I parked beneath the shelter's overhang, the wooden beams creaking softly as the van settled. The forest stretched in every direction, thick and breathing. A stream rushed somewhere unseen, a constant whisper beneath the canopy. For a long time, I sat behind the wheel, listening. No tapping, no strange shifts of weight inside the van, no breath that wasn't mine. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was patient. I stepped outside, needing to ground myself. The forest floor was soft beneath my boots, covered in pine needles that muted every step. The air felt thick, cool, wet with the promise of rain. A raven called overhead, the sound sharp and lonely. Normal. Comfortingly normal. I walked toward the bulletin board, half expecting to see something carved into it, something that confirmed my fear was rooted in something physical. But the notices were blank, peeled away by weather and time. Then a dull metallic glint caught my eye. Inside the stone shelter. My stomach tightened. I moved slowly toward it, each step deliberate, refusing to let fear dictate my actions. The shadows inside the shelter shifted with the breeze, but nothing moved that shouldn't. When I reached the wall, I froze. Another Volkswagen hubcap, resting upright against the stone, polished, perfect, waiting. A breath escaped me. Not fear, not panic, but something deeper. A realization that whatever followed me didn't need the desert. It didn't need the night. It didn't even need proximity. It knew where I was. It knew where I would go. It was leading me somewhere, guiding me with these metallic breadcrumbs. But for what? I crouched in front of the hubcap, studying the ground around it. Pine needles lay undisturbed, but beneath them, faint lines traced a path. Long, narrow impressions, too jointed, too unnatural. They led to the stone wall, circled the hubcap, then vanished into the woods as if the creature, or whatever it was, had melted into the undergrowth. Something brushed the air behind me. A soft shift. A breath. I spun around, flashlight raised, heart hammering so hard it blurred my vision. Nothing, just the forest bending with the wind, but the smell drifted stronger now, the metallic tang threading through the air, settling into my clothes. I backed away from the shelter, slow, controlled movements, refusing to break eye contact with the trees. The shadows twisted in ways that felt deliberate, as if trying to form shapes just beyond perception. When I reached the van, I climbed in, shut the door, and locked it. My breath trembled, but I forced it steady. Fear fed whatever followed me. I could feel that now. The panic, the spiraling, the erratic breathing. It made the air feel thicker inside the Volkswagen, as if my emotions called the thing closer. I gripped the steering wheel again, grounding myself in the feel of the worn leather beneath my palms. And then the van shifted, just slightly, as if something heavy had pressed down on the roof. My breath stopped. A slow, deliberate scrape trailed across the metal, moving from the driver's side toward the rear. Not tapping this time, not fingers, something else, something heavier. I didn't move. Every instinct screamed to drive, to peel out of that rest stop and leave the forest choking on dust. But I forced myself to stay still, to listen, to understand. Running hadn't helped. Distance hadn't helped. Until I knew what it wanted, I would never be free of it. The scrape stopped above the rear hatch. Silence settled in, thick and suffocating. Then a whisper. Not words, not breath. A sound like metal bending under slow pressure. The roof dented inward. Just a fraction. Barely visible, but enough to feel. The van creaked under the shifting weight. I squeezed the steering wheel so tightly my fingers went numb. The thing wasn't just following me. It was testing the van, testing me, pushing the boundaries of what separated us, testing what it would take to get inside. The dent deepened another millimeter, then another. The metal groaned softly. I couldn't stay. I knew that now. Whatever this was, whatever had marked me at Clearwater Bluff, it wasn't interested in being subtle anymore. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. The pressure on the roof lifted instantly. No scrape, no sound, just absence. As if the moment the engine growled, whatever had been on top of the van vanished into the air. I slammed the van into drive and tore out of the rest stop, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My eyes fixed on the road ahead, the trees blurring into streaks of green and shadow. The metallic smell faded as I drove, but something else replaced it, a realization slowly blooming in my chest like cold fire. Hubcaps weren't the only things left behind in abandoned campgrounds. People left things too. Memories, regrets, marks on the world, and sometimes the world marked them back. That thing, whatever followed me, wasn't haunting places. It was haunting the people who stepped into them. People like me. And the deeper truth settled into me with a dread I couldn't escape. The abandoned campgrounds weren't abandoned at all. They were waiting. And now they had my name. I drove until the road straightened into a long, pale ribbon cutting through foothills that rose like tired shoulders on either side. The world outside the windshield seemed to hold its breath. Even the engine's steady rumble felt quieter, as though the van knew something was changing. Something was drawing closer to its end. The thing, whatever had followed me across deserts, woods, rest stops, it hadn't appeared again since the rest area. No hubcaps placed deliberately in my path. No dents blooming from the roof. No tapping. No breathing. No whispers brushing the metal shell of my world. That silence felt worse. Like it had retreated not because it was gone, but because it had decided exactly where it wanted me to be. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the sun began to sink behind the hills, painting the sky in long strokes of orange and bruised purple. The Volkswagen hummed beneath me, each vibration grounding me in a reality that felt increasingly thin. Eventually, a turnoff appeared, not on my map, not marked by any signage, just a gravel path leading toward a valley of low, dark pines. I should have driven past it. I should have ignored the pull that tugged at my chest like invisible thread, but I felt it, the way the air thickened, the way the sky dimmed ever so subtly, the way the quiet unease hardened into something sharper, suspicion, recognition, fate. I slowed the van and turned onto the gravel. The path wound downward, deeper into shadows shaped by trees older than any memory in my head. Branches leaned inward, narrowing the sky into a sliver. The air cooled quickly, almost unnaturally, until the breath leaving my mouth curled in faint white wisps. Another sign, another warning, or another invitation. At the base of the hill, the path opened into a clearing, and I knew the place immediately. Not because I'd been there before, but because it carried the same atmosphere Clearwater Bluff had, an abandoned campground that didn't want to be forgotten. A ring of empty campsites circled the clearing, each one marked by stones and long-dead fire pits. A central pavilion sagged under its own weight, wooden beams cracked and furred with lichen. A tattered sign hung from a post, half swallowed by vines. The lettering was barely readable under grime and age, but I made it out. Valley Cedar Campground. Closed. Forgotten. Waiting. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. This wasn't me stumbling onto another abandoned campground by mistake. The thing was drawing me here, guiding me the way a spider guides something trapped in its web, letting it wander just long enough to think it still has choices. I pulled into the center of the clearing, cut the engine. The silence hit instantly. No wind, no birds, no insects, no creaking trees, just stillness so thick it felt like cotton stuffed into my ears. I exhaled slowly, forcing the air out of my lungs, anchoring myself in the rhythm of breath. This time, I didn't wait for the tapping. I didn't wait for the scrape. I didn't wait for the hubcap appearing where it shouldn't. I stepped out of the van with the flashlight in one hand and a tight, burning knot of resolve in my chest. Every part of me wanted to run, to escape, to put 100 miles between myself and whatever had been stalking me. But fear without confrontation is just slow surrender. And I wasn't here to surrender. I walked toward the pavilion, the flashlight beam slicing through the stillness. The ground felt too soft under my boots, as though it had been disturbed recently, as though something had moved through it, waiting for my arrival. When I reached the pavilion, I stopped, because there, arranged in a perfect half circle on the concrete floor, were 6 Volkswagen hubcaps, all upright, all polished, all turned toward me like silent, reflective eyes. My stomach twisted, but I didn't step back. I walked forward, forcing myself to look at each one. And then I realized they weren't random. Each hubcap had markings on its interior rim, scratches, gouges, etchings, shallow but deliberate. I lifted one carefully, angling it toward the flashlight. Names. 6 different names, carved with something sharp, each one etched deeply enough to remain legible despite time and weather. I read them one by one. Michael Grady, Hannah Torres, Elena Shaw, Travis Hoyt, Peter Lang. And one more, I froze. Adrian Burke, my own name, etched exactly like the rest. Cold spread through my chest, radiating outward until my hands trembled. The hubcap slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the concrete, spinning before settling flat. My name, here, waiting. This wasn't just haunting, this was claiming. I backed away slowly, breath shallow, pulse pounding in my ears. The clearing felt smaller now, the trees leaning inward as if listening, as if observing. A soft sound broke the silence, a metallic shift. Behind me, I turned. The van's rear door was ajar, just barely, but I knew I had closed it, locked it. I took a step toward it, flashlight shaking in my hand. The door creaked slightly, a fraction of an inch, a whisper of movement inside. Not footsteps, not breath. Something shifting its weight, adjusting itself. Waiting. I swallowed hard, forcing air into lungs that didn't want it. This was the moment fear had been leading me toward, not panic, not dread, but clarity. That silent space where terror gives you a choice, run blindly or face what's chasing you. I stepped toward the van, another shift inside, soft, deliberate, familiar in the worst way. I reached out and placed my hand on the door. Warmth radiated through the metal. That same impossible warmth I'd felt in the desert, on the roof, on the smears left behind. My grip tightened, and I pulled the door open. The interior was dark, still, empty. Except for one thing. On the floor at the foot of my bedding lay a piece of metal shaped like a half moon, a 7th hubcap. But this one wasn't polished. This one was bent, twisted slightly, as though something had held it too tightly while carving into it. I raised the flashlight. The light passed over the jagged grooves. My name wasn't on this one. Not yet. Half the surface was carved. Half the surface was untouched. Waiting for the final mark. Waiting for me. I stumbled back, breath tearing out of me. The forest seemed to exhale around me, the air shifting with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the clearing. It wasn't here to harm me. It was here to complete something. Something that began long before I stepped into Clearwater Bluff. Something tied to these abandoned places, these forgotten campgrounds where memories lingered like ghosts and stories never ended cleanly. I lifted the hubcap. The metal throbbed faintly with warmth, almost like a heartbeat. My hands trembled as I turned it over. A single line had already been carved into the untouched half. A starting cut, a first stroke. The beginning of my name. A. My breath broke. The thing wasn't chasing me, it was marking me, claiming me as part of the story left behind. The forest darkened as the last sliver of sun vanished behind the hills. Shadows stretched, silence deepened. And in that absolute stillness, I understood the truth that had been circling me like a slow, inevitable orbit. Abandoned campgrounds don't stay abandoned, they remember, they recollect, they keep. And now, I was one of the things they intended to keep. The clearing felt colder now, as if the night had teeth. My breath rose in thin, unsteady streams as I stared at the hubcap with that single carved letter A, waiting for the rest of my name to be completed. My pulse hammered so loudly it felt like the sound alone might call the thing out of the trees. But nothing moved. Nothing revealed itself. Nothing pounced or whispered or scraped against the van. It just waited, and that waiting felt worse than any attack. My flashlight beam trembled across the twisted metal. I held the hubcap at arm's length, as if distance could dull the weight of what it meant. But the truth pressed into me from every direction. This thing, this presence, wasn't a creature chasing prey. It was more like a custodian of forgotten places, a collector of those who wandered too deeply into stories that weren't finished. Those hubcaps weren't trophies. They were markers, gravestones without graves, names without bodies, lives claimed not by violence, but by something quieter, older, more patient. The abandoned campgrounds weren't left behind by people. People were left behind by the campgrounds. A cold truth settled in me. Whatever had happened to the 6 people whose names were etched into the hubcaps, it hadn't been sudden. It had been deliberate, gradual, a slow claiming. And now I was next. I backed away from the van, away from the pavilion, away from the ring of hubcaps that seemed to watch me with reflective, unblinking eyes. The air thickened, carrying a faint hum, low, almost below hearing, but steady, pulsing, rhythmic. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't natural. It felt like a voice without words, trying to shape sound into meaning I wasn't built to understand. I stood in the center of the clearing, wind brushing lightly across my face, as if the whole night were breathing around me. My fear peaked, not wild panic, but a cold, crystalline dread that clarified everything. I understood now why people disappear without a trace in places like this. Not because they die, not because they get lost, because something erases the part of them that knows how to go home. My fingers tightened around the hubcap. It was warm again, warmer than before, like the heat of a hand, or the heat of breath. The hum deepened. The treetops shivered. The van creaked as though something pressed lightly against the roof again. But this time I didn't feel trapped. I felt chosen. And that realization frightened me more than any tapping or scraping ever could. Fear surged upward, but I forced myself to breathe through it. Not because I wanted to be brave, because I didn't want this thing, whatever had been following me, to finish carving my name into the hubcap. I didn't want to disappear from myself. I didn't want to be another story abandoned in a forgotten campground, misremembered by the world until even my memory became nothing more than a reflective shine in the dirt. I turned toward the van. The roof dented minutely, responding to my movement as if acknowledging me. I swallowed hard. "Not tonight," I whispered. My voice sounded foreign, small, but it was the only anchor I had. I slid the van door shut, the familiar click grounding me in the physical world. I climbed into the driver's seat and shoved the keys into the ignition with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The hum grew louder. The trees leaned inward. A shape, just a distortion, the suggestion of limbs bending where limbs shouldn't, shifted between the trunks at the far side of the clearing. My heart stopped. It wasn't approaching. It wasn't hiding. It was watching. Everything in me wanted to break, to scream, to run into the night until my legs failed. But I tightened my grip on the wheel, exhaled slowly, and turned the key. The engine hesitated. The hum intensified. The shape drew taller, rising unnaturally, elongating like a shadow pulled upward by invisible strings. "Come on," I whispered to the van. "Come on. Please." The engine sputtered and roared to life. The hum broke like a snapped wire. The shape collapsed into the trees as if the sound shattered its form. I slammed the van into reverse, tires spitting gravel, like the headlights catching a glimpse of something pale and jointed slipping between trunks faster than anything had a right to move. My breath tore out in ragged bursts as I swung the van around, straightened it, and floored the accelerator. The road out of the campground twisted upward. Every turn, too narrow, too steep, too sudden. Branches slapped the sides of the van. Rocks scattered beneath the tires. The hum faded behind me, replaced by the roar of the engine and the wild hammer of my pulse. Halfway up the hill, the headlights flickered. Not from a battery issue, not from a faulty wire. A pulse, a pattern. 2 flashes, pause. 3 flashes, pause. The same rhythm as the tapping on the van's rear panel in Clearwater Bluff. It was communicating, or warning, or calling me back. I clenched my jaw and kept driving. The engine groaned, the incline steepened, gravel skidded underfoot, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow. I didn't listen. At the top of the hill, the forest opened. The night sky widened. Stars spilled across it in a cold and brilliant wash. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until the incline leveled and the headlights steadied again. Only then did I look in the rearview mirror. Nothing followed. No shape. No hum. Just a dark forest and a road that vanished into its throat. I should have felt safe. But I didn't feel anything at all. Not until I reached the highway miles later, where a lone gas station glowed like a small sun in the darkness. I pulled in slowly, parking beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The Volkswagen idled with a steady, familiar vibration. A human sound. A friendly sound. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and let myself breathe, really breathe, for the first time since Clearwater Bluff. The night didn't breathe back. No tapping, no warmth, no shifting weight. When I finally stepped out, the cool air felt clean, empty, safe. The world smelled like gasoline and asphalt and dust instead of metal and cold breath. I walked toward the rear of the van, bracing myself for what I might find. The dents from the roof were still there. The faint smears across the hatch, too. Proof, not nightmares. Not illusions, not stress hallucinations. Proof that something existed out there in the abandoned places, something old enough and patient enough to leave its mark on the world and on me. I opened the rear door. The 7th hubcap still lay where I dropped it on the floor. The carved line, just the letter A, seemed deeper now, sharper, as though the metal remembered the moment it was made and sharpened it in the telling. I lifted it slowly, turning it over in my hands. The metal was cold again, lifeless. Waiting, but not reaching. Not anymore. I set it gently on the ground beside the van. The decision settled in my chest with a weight that felt real, solid, earned. That thing might have chosen me, but I didn't have to choose it back. I didn't have to continue the story it wanted to write. I stood tall beneath the gas station lights, breathing deeply, letting the fear settle into something quieter inside me. Not gone, but understood. Some places want to keep you. Some places want to finish you. But sometimes survival isn't running. Sometimes survival is refusing to belong to the things that want to claim you. I climbed back into the van, closed the door, and drove toward the rising edge of dawn, the horizon slowly shifting from black to blue. The abandoned campgrounds would always be out there, waiting, remembering, collecting. But I would keep moving, because the road, my road, wasn't finished yet, and neither was I. I didn't expect the desert to sound alive at night, not in the way it did that evening when the cold crept over the sand like something with intent. The first sign that the world around me had shifted was the silence, not the ordinary kind you get in the Mojave where the land feels like a held breath, but a deeper quiet, a velvet hush that seemed to muffle even my own pulse. I had the sense that the air itself was listening. I had taken my 1987 Volkswagen Westphalia out for a winter retreat, hoping to outrun the noise in my head. That van had become my little moving sanctuary, the closest thing I had to a compass after a year that pulled me apart in ways I still didn't fully admit. People thought I camped alone because I liked solitude. The truth was more tangled. I camped because silence didn't judge me. Because the desert, vast, indifferent, timeless, made my problems feel small. Because out there, no one expected me to pretend things were okay. I'd parked at a dispersed spot just outside Valley of Fire State Park, the kind of place where the dirt roads unravel into the emptiness and cell signals give up entirely. A handful of people knew the area, but most travelers kept to the official campgrounds. I preferred spots like this, the pull-offs used by locals who trusted their tires and their instincts. That evening, the only other rig anywhere near me was an old beige Toyota Tacoma about 200 yards away, camper shell attached, a single lawn chair folded next to it. I never saw the driver, but I'd noticed the footprints earlier. Heavy, deliberate, maybe a hunter. Maybe someone like me, hiding from something that didn't leave bruises on the skin. My plan was simple. Heat some canned chili on the Westphalia's tiny stove, journal a bit, watch the stars sharpen against the night. But right after sunset, the temperature dropped faster than it should have. The wind came first, a rough, restless sweep that rattled the van's pop top and carried grains of sand like thrown salt. I told myself it was normal. Desert winds are moody, they shift without warning. But when the first cold flake hit my cheek, dissolving before I registered what it was, I couldn't shake the unease. Snow was the last thing that belonged out there. I stepped out of the van, boots crunching over the cold-packed sand as I scanned the sky. Thin, pale flakes spiraled down like ash, catching in the light of my lantern. Above me, the clouds pulsed with an unnatural heaviness, as if smothering the stars I'd come to find. I'd grown up in Arizona. I knew storms. But this was wrong. The air felt too charged, too expectant. The desert wasn't a place for snow. Not like this. Not in this sudden, smothering way. I climbed back into the Westphalia, rubbing warmth into my hands. The heater groaned but eventually obeyed, releasing a thin stream of air that carried the soft scent of dust and old fabric. My headlights carved two weak beams into the white flecked darkness, illuminating nothing but swirling flakes and a faint outline of formations in the distance. The world felt smaller, shrinking around the van like a tightening grip. That was when I noticed the knocking. It came in a pattern. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 quicker ones. At first, I thought it was the wind, some loose panel on the exterior slapping against the cold. But the sound wasn't coming from the outside. It echoed through the frame of the van with a subtle vibration that seemed to crawl under my skin. I held my breath, waiting for it to return. When it did, the pattern repeated with the same unsettling precision. I closed my eyes and counted the beats. 3 and 2. 3 and 2. It reminded me of a heartbeat struggling to find its rhythm. I tried to rationalize it. Old vans make noises, metal contracts in the cold. Something is shifting with the temperature, but my chest tightened anyway. If you camp long enough, you learn to listen to the whispers of your gut, and mine was clawing at me. I pulled out my phone, though I knew it would be useless. No service, no map, no weather updates, no warnings about what was rolling toward me. Just the faint glow of the screen reflecting my own uneasy expression. For a moment, I considered packing up and driving back toward the main road, but the storm had already thickened. My tires were good, but desert mud was unpredictable. One wrong move and the Westphalia could sink. The knocking returned, louder this time, echoing up from the floor near the sliding door. I knelt down and pressed my palm to the cold metal. The vibration thrummed faintly, like something beneath my hand was reaching up through the chassis. When the next set of taps hit, it felt like it was using the entire frame of the van to communicate. Something about it felt intentional. I backed away, heart hammering, and reached for my lantern again. Its warm light washed over the interior, painting soft glows across the wooden cabinets and the faded upholstery I'd spent the summer repairing. This van had been with me through worse: thunderstorms in the Rockies, a close call with flash flooding in Zion, a broken fuel pump outside Flagstaff that stranded me until dawn. But never had it felt like a boundary between me and something I couldn't explain. Outside, the snow thickened, swirling in a way that made it look almost alive. I watched it through the windows, each flake tumbling down with eerie determination. The Tacoma's silhouette was still visible through the haze, but the lawn chair had toppled over, no sign of its owner. I told myself they were inside, maybe sleeping or listening to music. But the idea didn't comfort me. Then came the whistle, It drifted across the snow like a thin, cold ribbon, high, wavering, carried by the wind, but unmistakably human. Not a tune, not random. A single sustained note, rising and falling in a slow cadence that felt too deliberate to be an accident. I froze. It came from the direction of the Tacoma. The whistle continued, steady and patient. My breath fogged the window as I leaned forward, squinting. Something moved near the truck, a dark shape shifting behind the camper shell. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of it, but the snow distorted everything, bending shadows into unfamiliar forms. When the whistle stopped, the silence felt predatory. I stepped back from the window, the lantern casting my shadow long across the interior. My thoughts darted in circles, trying to latch onto logic, but logic felt small and fragile in that moment. I'd dealt with strange things before, weird calls in the night, coyotes crying like babies, footsteps that didn't belong to any person or animal I could identify. But this was different. This felt directed. I reached for my keys, stuffing them into my jacket pocket. I wasn't going to drive into the storm, but if something happened, I needed to be ready. The heater hummed behind me. The knocking had stopped, but the memory of it pulsed in my hands. I sat down on the edge of the bench seat and forced my breath into something steadier. Fear has a way of magnifying sound, stretching shadows, twisting the ordinary into something monstrous. I'd learned that more than once. I told myself I might be overreacting, that the whistle could be someone calling for help, that the movement near the Tacoma was just the owner securing something in the cold. But even as I argued with myself, the air shifted. A low groan swept across the desert, not from the van, not from the storm, but from somewhere deeper, the land itself. It rolled under the Westphalia like a giant exhale, shaking the tires and sending a ripple through my chest. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. When the groan faded, the whistle returned. Only now it was closer. And this time, it wasn't coming from the Tacoma. It was coming from somewhere behind my van. The whistle slid through the air like a cold blade, thin and trembling, rising just enough to let me know it wasn't the wind. Wind doesn't breathe between notes. Wind doesn't linger. This sound lingered, almost savoring the silence before it cut through it again. My spine stiffened in that slow, creeping way fear sometimes climbs, like it's choosing each rung carefully. I didn't move at first. Movement felt like an invitation. Instead, I stayed seated on the bench seat, eyes locked on the rear windows of the Westphalia, where the darkness pressed like wet ink. The snow, illuminated by the lantern light inside, looked thicker now, each flake drifting sideways as if nudged by hands I couldn't see. That kind of sideways snow happens when a storm builds. But this didn't feel like weather. It felt like the whole desert was turning itself, adjusting around me. The whistle came again, shorter this time, almost curious. I rose slowly, avoiding the instinct to rush. My boots barely made a sound against the old van's flooring, the soles worn smooth from 1,000 little escapes and retreats. I reached the rear window and tilted my head just enough to peer through the fogged glass. All I saw were shadows. Snow. A faint impression of the nearest sandstone formation stretching out like some half-buried spine. But something was out there. Something that wanted me to know it was out there. I found the flashlight stashed in the drawer beneath the sink. Its metal felt colder than the air, biting into my skin. I clicked it on, the beam slicing through the van's interior with a harsh white glare. I didn't want to open the rear hatch, but fear is greedy. It demands answers even when answers are the last thing you should look for. I edged to the sliding door instead. The van groaned slightly when I unlocked it, the soft metallic click alarming in the cavernous quiet. For a second, I hesitated with my hand on the handle. Every instinct I had, every memory from every campground where something felt off whispered at me to leave it shut, to trust the walls of the van, thin though they were. But another part of me, the part that hated not knowing, the part that needed to understand danger before I could escape it, pushed forward. I cracked the door open. Snow swirled in immediately, cold needles against my face. The wind carried a faint, almost sour smell, something like wet stone mixed with cold earth. I stepped out slowly, flashlight pressed tight against my palm. The beam carved a trembling path through the storm, illuminating only a short tunnel of swirling white. "Hello?" I called out, hating how small my voice sounded. "If you need help, say something." The desert answered with silence. The Tacoma was nothing but a shadow through the storm, its shape distorted. The lawn chair lay half buried now. I scanned the ground around the Westphalia. No fresh footprints, no movement, nothing to explain the whistle. But the sound had been close, too close to dismiss. I turned slowly, flashlight sweeping the rear of the van. Snow clung to the bumper in uneven patches, already thickening along the edges. A single dark shape jutted from beneath the chassis, making my heart seize for a moment before I realized it was just a mound of frozen mud. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then something shifted. Not sound, not sight. A subtle pressure, a sensation that crawled under the surface of the skin, like the moment before lightning finds a place to land. I scanned the line of rock formations again, the massive shapes looming through the flurries. A figure stood between two of them, just a silhouette, thin, still, almost merging with the shadows. My flashlight beam jittered when it landed on the shape. Too far to see a face, too close to pretend I imagined it. I raised the light higher. For a second, the figure looked like it leaned forward. Or maybe the snow distorted it. "Hey," I called out, voice cracking. "Are you okay? Do you need something?" The figure didn't respond. The beam flickered, guttering like a candle in a draft. The storm pressed around me, swallowing sound. When the flashlight steadied again, the silhouette was gone. I jerked the beam left, then right. Nothing. Just endless white and stone. The whistle came again. This time, it sounded inches from my ear. I spun so fast I nearly slipped, the flashlight tumbling from my hand and landing softly in the snow. The light pointed upward now, as casting a long beam into the falling flakes. The air felt suddenly warmer, just for a moment, like something had stepped in close enough to radiate heat. I staggered backward toward the van, fumbling for the door handle. The cold steel felt like salvation. I yanked it open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut so hard the entire van shuddered. The whistle stopped instantly. Only the screaming quiet of the storm remained. I crouched near the door for a moment, forehead pressed against the cold metal, breath shaking. My lungs felt too small for the air. I reached for the flashlight, but I'd left it outside. The lantern cast a soft orange glow through the van, its light shifting with every gust of wind that rocked the frame. Something brushed the outside panel. Not a hit, not a scratch, a glide, like fingers tracing the shape of the metal. I pressed my palms flat against the interior wall. The vibration was faint, but it was there. A deliberate, searching pressure. My mind raced. No footprints near the van, no visible approach through the snow. Whatever I'd seen near the rocks couldn't have moved that fast. The whistle had come from behind me, too close, too sudden. None of it fit together. And the storm outside had sealed me into this moment, turning the world into a white void. I rose slowly and moved toward the front seats. The windshield was half fogged, half frosted, giving everything beyond it a warped, dreamlike shape. I scraped a circle clear with my sleeve and peered out. The Tacoma's door was open. Its interior light flickered weakly, barely visible through the sideways snow. The camper shell door hung crooked, swaying with each gust. Whoever had been there wasn't there anymore, or wasn't in the truck anymore. My throat tightened. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to, scanning the ground for footprints. The snow was too heavy now, erasing everything within minutes. All I could see was a vague indentation trail leading away from the truck and then disappearing into the storm. I told myself to stay inside, to lock the doors, wait for morning, and not let my fear push me into something reckless. Storms like this were dangerous. People got lost within feet of their rigs, but something in me twisted with the memory of the open door, the impression of movement, the whistle that felt like it was searching. I didn't want to find a stranger's body in the morning, or be found by something else entirely. I reached for the ignition key. The Westphalia sputtered awake, the engine's rumble filling the cabin like a low, comforting growl. I clicked on the headlights. They pushed a weak, yellow wash into the storm, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The desert now vanished into a moving wall of white. I kept my hand on the gear shift, hesitating. If I left, I risked getting stuck, sliding off the track, losing all orientation. If I stayed, the whistle drifted across the windshield again, not from outside, from the roof. A gentle, wavering note vibrating through the pop-top canvas like something crawling across it, something tracing the seams. I gripped the steering wheel as if it were a lifeline. Outside, the storm howled. Above me, something whispered. The sound on the roof moved in slow arcs, a delicate pressure shifting across the pop-top like fingertips testing fabric. The canvas trembled with each small touch, tiny shivers running through the structure of the van. My breath fogged the cold air inside the cabin. For a moment, I forgot about the storm outside, because the storm wasn't the thing threatening to crush me. It was whatever was above me, tracing the seams of the Volkswagen like it was learning its shape. I stayed perfectly still. Even blinking felt loud. The roof dipped with a faint weight. Not enough to collapse anything. Just enough to let me know something real, something with mass, intent, rested directly above my head. Then the weight shifted again, the sound crossing from one side to the other with slow confidence. The heater fan rattled, coughing warm breath. I reached toward the headlight switch, turned it off, and let the darkness swallow me. I didn't want to see the outline of anything if it suddenly pressed against the canvas. Sometimes darkness protects you from knowing too much. Sometimes that's the only shield you get. I slid down from the seat, crouching low between the counter and the bench like a trapped animal searching for smaller shadows. The roof creaked. A faint exhale sifted through the damp canvas, brushing the back of my neck with cold breath. I bit down hard on my lip, willing myself not to make a sound. That breath didn't feel human. I counted silently in my head to steady myself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. I couldn't even count right. Fear scrambled the numbers. I tried again. The sound above shifted, moving toward the rear of the vehicle. The canvas fluttered as if brushed by a slow-moving hand. I dared one breath through my teeth, quick and thin. The roof suddenly stilled. Silence draped itself over the van. Outside, the snow hammered sideways, wind howling across the formations with a voice that sounded almost like language. The desert is clever like that. It knows how to borrow the timbre of things you fear. A new sound cracked through the storm. A door slamming. Metal against metal. I jerked upright, heart thrashing. Headlights flickered faintly in the distance, where the Tacoma had been. A shadow lurched into view, illuminated in a fragmented glow as the storm broke and bent the beam. It moved with an uneven stagger, arms swaying. For half a second, I thought the stranger was alive, fighting through the blizzard toward my van. Then the figure collapsed. I stood frozen. The roof above me had gone utterly quiet. Whatever had been tracing the canvas was gone, or simply waiting. I couldn't tell. When the figure in the snow didn't move again, instinct slammed through me. I grabbed my coat, yanked my beanie low, and shoved the sliding door open with a clatter swallowed immediately by wind. My boots sank into a thick layer of powder I hadn't expected. The storm had transformed the desert into something unrecognizable. The sandstone ridges were blurred into ghost-like slopes. My flashlight, the one I dropped earlier, stuck out of the snow at an angle, faintly glowing beneath a crust of ice. I grabbed it, brushed it off, and followed the shallow trough where the figure had fallen. "Hey!" I shouted, though the wind shredded the sound as soon as it left my mouth. "Hey, can you hear me?" I reached the body in seconds, dropping to my knees. The person lay face down, jacket stiff with frost, hair frozen to the collar. I pressed 2 fingers to the neck. Cold, too cold, no pulse. Before I could react, a sharp crack echoed behind me. From the roof of the Westphalia, I spun, snow whipping into my eyes, and raised the flashlight. Something stood on top of my van. It was only a silhouette, a tall, narrow outline against the swirling white, but every nerve in my body lit up like I grabbed a live wire. It was standing upright, feet planted on the pop top with impossible balance, head tilted at a crooked angle. A long arm hung at its side. The other reached forward, pressing its palm against the canvas roof as if remembering the texture. Then it began to whistle. Not loud, not dramatic, soft, slow. A single wavering note that threaded the storm with deliberate patience. The sound wasn't violent, but something in it twisted my insides. It hit me with the same pressure you feel when a stranger stands too close. The instinctive alarm that screams you are being watched, chosen, targeted. I stumbled backward from the fallen stranger, boots slipping. The thing on the roof didn't move. It just kept whistling, the note bending in ways human lungs couldn't reproduce. I forced myself to step forward through the wind, toward the van, toward safety, or whatever safety meant now. My flashlight trembled violently, and each step felt like I was walking into a dare. The figure leaned forward. The whistle deepened into a low, vibrating tone that crawled across my skin. As I reached the sliding door, the figure dropped. Not down, forward. It launched from the roof with a disturbing, boneless fluidity and vanished into the whiteout behind the van. Not a single footprint appeared where it landed. The whistle dissolved into the storm. I didn't waste a second. I tore open the door, threw myself inside, slammed it shut, and locked all 3 latches with shaking fingers. The winds battered the van like fists. The Tacoma's collapsed stranger remained motionless in the snow. I crawled into the driver's seat, started the engine, and tried to breathe through the rising panic. The headlights carved a tiny cave of light through the storm, enough to illuminate maybe 20 feet ahead. That was all I had. I shifted into first gear. The Westphalia lurched. Not forward, down. Something clamped around the rear axle. The whole van jerked violently, metal straining as if being dragged backward. My scream died in my throat. I slammed the accelerator, wheels spinning uselessly in the snow. The engine roared, tires clawing at the frozen earth. The rear end lifted slightly, dragged, then it let go. The van shot forward like it had been released from a trap. I wrestled the wheel, struggling to keep the lights pointed toward the barely visible trail. Snow blasted across the windshield in streaks, wipers fighting to keep up. I crawled the van forward, inch by desperate inch, praying the tires wouldn't sink. Something moved parallel to me, a dark blur slicing through the blizzard with unnatural speed. I didn't look. I couldn't. My whole body was locked on survival. The headlights flickered. The engine sputtered once, then steadied. I whispered thanks into the darkness, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles burned. If the engine died in this storm, in the middle of whatever this was, I wouldn't make it. The van wouldn't restart cold. It barely restarted warm these days. The road curved slightly north. I knew I had at least 2 miles before the trail met the main paved road. At this speed, it might as well have been 20. The blur appeared again. Closer. Matching my pace. Then it vanished behind a wall of white. When the whistle returned, it came from everywhere at once, from the storm, from the engine, from inside my skull. I gritted my teeth, digging through the panic for some shred of reason. I forced the van to keep going, foot by foot, yard by yard. 10 minutes passed like 10 hours. Then the snow thinned. Not much, just enough for the headlights to reach a little farther. I saw the faint glimmer of reflective road paint, the edge of the paved road. Civilization, distance, escape. The van rattled onto the asphalt, tires slipping before catching. I pushed it faster. The whistle stopped, and the world fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet. I didn't look back. Not when the storm faded behind me. Not when the desert turned from chaos to stillness. Not even when I saw the distant glow of a small ranger station light cutting through the night like a trembling lighthouse. I parked in a crooked line across 3 spaces, adrenaline shaking through me. I stumbled inside the building, where a lone ranger in his late 50s was finishing a thermos of coffee. He blinked as I crashed through the door, covered in snow, breathless and half-frozen. "Storm caught me," I managed, his brow furrowed. "What storm?" I stared at him. He gestured toward the window. Calm desert air drifted past the glass. Not a flake of snow on the ground, not a cloud in the sky. "Forecast's been clear for days," he said. "You sure you're all right?" I didn't answer, because behind me, faint and wavering, leaking through the doorframe from the empty desert beyond, I heard a whistle. A thin, rising note, curious, patient, searching. And I understood something then, something that still presses against the base of my throat whenever I think about that night. Brush up against the desert's wild edge long enough, and sometimes it brushes back. Sometimes it learns your shape, sometimes it follows. Sometimes it waits for winter in a place winter was never meant to be. And if you ever hear the snow whisper in the Mojave, if you ever hear the cold sing your name, do not answer, not even once. I should have known something was wrong the moment I turned off Highway 62 and felt the asphalt drop away beneath my tires. The road into Rogue Valley always looked a little warped this time of year. Heat shimmer bending the distance, pine shadows stretching too far across the gravel, but that afternoon it felt like the ground was tilting, pulling me inward, like the valley had been waiting. I was driving my old Volkswagen Westphalia, the one I'd sunk too much money and memory into. The engine hummed steady, a comfort I depended on more than I admitted. The air smelled like dust and juniper, pretty typical for southern Oregon in late summer. But then the scent shifted, faint like smoke but metallic too, almost like wet wire. I tried to ignore it. My plan was simple: follow a primitive forest road and quiet clearing near the Rogue River, camp for 2 nights, record some nature audio for a project I'd been half finishing for months. I wanted solitude. I wanted a reset. But there's wanting solitude, and then there's being alone in a way that feels directed. The first odd thing happened about 20 minutes in. I slowed at a fork where a wooden sign should have been. I'd driven this route twice before, and I distinctly remembered a sign carved with Ridge Spur 28417. A friend of mine, Evan, a wildlife photographer, once told me that the locals called it the root-bound path because the roots there grew in thick ropes over the trail, like something dragging itself toward the road. But now the sign was gone. The wooden post was still in the ground, but the board itself had been ripped clean off. No splintering, no hardware left behind. Just gone. I tapped the brakes, leaned forward, squinting, trying to reconstruct the map from memory. I knew the right turn dropped you toward a ridge. The left curved deeper into the valley. But in that moment, everything felt reversed, like the valley had shifted while I wasn't looking. When I finally chose the left, the air inside the van went strangely still. No airflow through the vents, no breeze slipping past the windows, just a heavy, unmoving quiet. My ears rang slightly the way they do when an airplane changes pressure. I told myself it was nothing. Heat, elevation, imagination. I kept driving. The deeper I went, the more the forest pressed in. Thick trunks twisted like they were leaning forward, curious. The road narrowed, funneling me between banks of ferns that brushed the sides of the van. I rolled my window down to listen to the sounds of the woods, birds, insects, the far-off rush of the river. But what I heard instead was a faint hiss, not natural, too steady, almost electrical, like an old radio caught between stations. Static. I paused with my hand on the wheel. It wasn't coming from the van. I turned the radio off entirely, unplugged the auxiliary cable, pressed my ear near the dash. Nothing. The sound was coming from outside. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice caught in my throat. Static in the woods? Maybe a distant power line? But I knew there weren't any out here. Then something else layered itself under the hiss, just for a second. A rhythm. Soft. Repeating. Almost like footsteps? No, I shut the window and drove faster, feeling stupid for letting my mind turn every noise into a threat. The worst part was that I knew this about myself. I'd always been a little too aware, too reactive. My therapist once told me I had pattern sensitivity, a brain that tried to connect dots even when they didn't belong together. A survival instinct evolved a little too high, she'd said. A joke. Mostly. Still, it made me doubt everything I sensed. The clearing finally opened up around a bend, and relief loosened the tightness in my chest. The spot was just as I remembered. A flat patch of earth ringed by mossy stones, a fire pit in the middle, and a narrow view of the river through the trees. I parked with the back of the van facing the water and stepped out, letting the sun hit my face. The air tasted normal again. The strange smell was gone. The static, too. I unloaded slowly, grounding myself in the movements. Cooler, camp stove, folding table, sleeping bag. I unrolled an old canvas tarp, spreading it next to the van like a welcome mat. The breeze brushed past me, warm and dry. For a moment, everything was exactly what I'd come here for. But when I went to set up my tent, I noticed something strange along the edge of the clearing. A marking on one of the pines, a carved circle with 3 short lines radiating from it like a crude sun. Weathered. Old. Familiar. I'd seen that symbol before. Last year, in a video someone posted online, an account of strange echoes in Crater Lake National Park. The guy claimed the sound followed him no matter how far he hiked. The video ended abruptly. A week later, the entire channel vanished, scrubbed, re-uploaded by someone else with different audio. When I tried to find the original description, it was gone too. The symbol had appeared in a still frame, just for a second. A circle with 3 lines. Exactly like this. I reached out and touched the grooves in the bark. They were smooth. Too smooth, like they'd been worn down by fingertips over and over. A cold ripple ran through me. I stepped back. Probably unrelated, I muttered to myself. Probably nothing. But as I turned, the wind shifted direction again, and that metallic smell, like wet wire, brushed past my nose. My throat tightened. I finished setting up camp fast, more out of restlessness than fear. I kept glancing back at the tree. I hated that I couldn't stop looking at it. That symbol stuck in the corner of my mind like a stain. When the sun dipped lower, I decided to hike down toward the river before dark. The trail was narrow but clear, leading me through a tunnel of waist-high ferns. The deeper I walked, the cooler the air became. Too cool. A breeze slid past me like a breath. My skin prickled. It felt as if someone had stepped close behind me, but every time I turned, there was just the forest, still and indifferent. The sound of rushing water grew louder, but under it, I kept hearing that faint static, the same frequency, the same rhythm. It grew and faded like it was pacing me. At the riverbank, the world opened up again. The rogue moved steady and silver beyond the trees. I crouched near the edge, dipped my fingers into the water. It was shockingly cold, grounding, real. I stayed there longer than I meant to, staring at the ripples. That's when I noticed something in the mud. A footprint. Bare. Human. And deep enough that whoever made it had been standing there for a while. I looked around, pulse hammering. No movement. No voices. Just water and trees. I crouched closer. The footprint faced away from the river, toward the trail I had just come down. As if someone had been standing in that exact spot, watching the path. Watching me before I even arrived. The wind shifted again. The static stopped. The forest went silent. And then, I swear this is true, I heard a whisper. Just one word. Faint. Blurred around the edges, like a voice coming through a detuned radio. Back. I spun, but there was no one. The footprint seemed deeper now, like it had just been made. My hands shook. I stepped away slowly, forcing myself not to run. Running would make it real. Running would make me believe it. And belief was the one thing I still had control over. But the forest felt different. Wrong. As I started back up the trail, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The ferns weren't leaning outward the way they had before. They were leaning inward, toward the path, as if the trail itself had shifted behind me, as if something unseen was closing the way I came. By the time I reached camp, dusk had swallowed most of the clearing. The carving on the tree was darker now, the grooves catching what little light remained. I didn't want to look, but I felt like I had to. When I raised my eyes, something had changed. A second carving had appeared directly below the first. Same circle, same 3 lines, new, fresh, carved while I'd been gone. I stepped back until my legs hit the bumper of the van. My mind spiraled through the possibilities. Someone messing with me, a hiker, a local, but none of it explained the silence. The stillness, the smell, the footprint, or the voice. A chill wrapped around my spine. That's when I noticed the path leading out of the clearing, the one I'd driven in on. It looked narrower, like the forest had crept closer. I stood there with my breath held tight in my chest, trying to convince myself that the trail hadn't changed, that the trees hadn't moved, that the valley wasn't shifting around me like a living thing. But the sense of being enclosed, of being redirected, was impossible to shake. And then, somewhere beyond the darkening trees, I heard it again. The static. Closer this time. Waiting. The static grew until it threaded itself between the trees, a faint, pulsing hiss, sometimes high, sometimes low, like someone running their fingers across broken frequencies. It wasn't constant. It drifted, circling the clearing, brushing my ears in uneven bursts. Every ridge of sound felt intentional. I stood perfectly still, afraid that even a shift of my weight would acknowledge it. My van, usually my comfort, suddenly felt too thin, like the metal wasn't enough to keep something out. I grabbed the sliding door and pulled it open quietly, slipping inside as the static dipped, then swelled again. The door's latch clicked louder than I meant. Too loud. Instantly, the static stopped. I held my breath. Silence filled the clearing, pressed against the walls of the van, wrapped around the windows. Something was listening. I didn't turn on any lights. I sat on the edge of the bed platform, hands resting on my knees, waiting for my heart to slow down. It didn't. Somewhere out there, a twig snapped. It wasn't close, but the direction felt changed. Earlier, the sound had drifted from the riverside. Now it came from the road, or what used to be the road. I leaned forward slowly until I could peek through the curtains. What I saw didn't make sense. The path, wide enough before to comfortably drive through, looked almost swallowed. The trees leaned inward, branches braided overhead. The ferns that used to border the entrance now formed a sort of curtain. My headlights wouldn't be able to push through that. And worse, at the center of the path, maybe 20 feet out, something stood. At first, I thought it was a person. It had the shape, shoulders, a slight lean, but the silhouette didn't move. It didn't shift its weight, didn't breathe, didn't tilt its head like a curious hiker or lost camper. It was just there. Still. Too still. I blinked once, twice. The figure was gone. Not stepped away, not walked off. Just gone. The path looked empty again, the forest too close and too dark. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering so hard I felt it in my teeth. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Tricks of fading light, my own fear projecting shapes, shadows shifting when the last bit of daylight slipped behind the ridge. But even thinking that felt like lying to myself. I sat in the dim interior of the van, the air stale around me. My mind kept looping back to the footprint by the river, the symbols on the tree, the static, and that whisper. Back. What the hell did it mean? Back where? Back to the van? Back to the river? Back the way I came? Or turn back? Leave. Leave. I rubbed my eyes. I didn't want to be the person who ran from shadows. I'd spent a year trying to fix that part of myself, trying to see things clearly instead of through panic. But Rogue Valley didn't feel like a place built for clarity. It felt like somewhere that used your senses against you. Quiet anxiety morphed into rising tension. The van vibrated slightly, just enough to make me freeze. Not from the engine, not from the wind. It felt like a pressure change outside, like the air had thickened and pushed against the frame. I stepped carefully to the front seat and turned the ignition halfway, just enough to bring the dashboard to life. The battery indicator flicked on, then off. Normal, the radio screen lit up blue. Then the speakers let out a thin stream of static. I hadn't touched anything. The radio wasn't set to a station. The volume was at 0, yet the static pushed through anyway, soft at first, then sharpening, as if something outside was bleeding into the electronics. "Not possible," I whispered. Then the static broke, just for a fraction of a second, into what sounded like a voice. Not words, just a tone, rising, falling, echoed, distorted, like someone speaking inside a long metal tube. My breath caught, and then quiet again. I snapped the radio completely off. The noise didn't return. I pulled the keys out of the ignition and sat there, gripping them so tightly they dug into my palm. That's when headlights suddenly flashed through the clearing. I ducked instinctively, my heart lurching. A vehicle was coming down the path, bright, too bright, cutting through the trees at an angle that didn't seem right. The trees were too close for a car to pass. The path was nearly blocked, but the light's coming. Closer. Closer. White beams flared through the windshield, blinding. They washed across the pines, the ferns, the side panel of my van. Then they blinked out. Just gone. Not turned off, more like erased. My hand shook as I slowly lifted my head over the window edge. The entrance to the clearing was empty. No engine sound. No tires crunching gravel. No approaching vehicle. Nothing. I tried to breathe through the panic climbing up my throat. The forest had begun to feel like a closed room, the air thinning each second. I needed to leave. I swung into the driver's seat, jammed the keys into the ignition, and tried to start the engine. The van turned over once, twice. Then the engine caught, sputtering, then settling into a familiar rumbling idle. A wave of relief hit me so strong I nearly laughed. I turned on the headlights. They illuminated only a few yards, far less than they should. The forest soaked the light up like fabric drinking spilled water, but it was enough. I put the van in drive and rolled toward the narrowing entrance. The branches overhead sagged like an archway. Ferns brushed the sides, whispering against the metal. The smell of wet wire returned. Stronger now, thick and biting at the back of my throat. I leaned forward, gripping the wheel, inching through the corridor of vegetation. The static returned too, this time vibrating faintly through the van's chassis, like the entire metal frame was being used as an antenna. I pressed through the overgrowth until it parted slightly, enough for me to get speed. Once I hit the rough gravel of the forest road, I accelerated. But after barely a minute of driving, a cold realization washed over me. This wasn't the road I came in on. It curved in a wide arc that didn't make sense. The trees were spaced differently, tighter, and every few seconds I passed a tree with that same carved symbol, a circle with 3 lines, over and over, always on the left side of the road, repeating, watching. I slowed. My hands felt numb. I recognized this pattern from somewhere, a memory tugging just out of reach. Something Evan once mentioned during a conversation about hiking trails in southern Oregon. He'd said, if you see the same marks twice in opposite directions, you're not on a loop. You're not on a trail. You're somewhere off the map. At the time, we laughed. It had sounded like something rangers said to spook tourists. But right now, the symbols were all facing me, as if marking my passage, as if tracking it. I drove another few minutes. The road tightened again, funneling into dense underbrush. Then, impossibly, it opened into a clearing. Not my clearing, a different one, but it looked almost the same. Fire pit. Mossy stones, same pattern of trees, except for one difference. The van tracks in the dirt. My van tracks. My heart sank into my stomach. I put the van in park and stepped out slowly, scanning the soft earth beneath my boots. The tire marks led into the clearing and out toward the trail I had just come from. I knelt down and touched one of the prints. It was fresh, the edges sharp, my tread pattern unmistakable. I followed them with my eyes back toward the trees. The tracks entered the woods and disappeared. No continuation, no exit, as if the forest had swallowed the road the moment I drove through. I looked behind me at the path I had just taken. It wasn't there. Only ferns, only shadows, only the sound of faint static rising again. Panic surged hard and fast. I backed toward the van. My mind tried to thread explanations together. Loops in the road, misdirection, disorientation. But none held long enough to feel real. I slammed the van door shut, gripping the wheel with shaking fingers. That's when I saw it on the windshield. A smear. No, finger writing. 4 letters, written in dust. Back. The same word I'd heard whispered by the river. I wiped the glass with my sleeve, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The letters vanished easily, too easily. Like they hadn't been written with dust at all, but something lighter, something that didn't want to stay. My reflection in the windshield wavered, distorted by the faint tremor of the van idling. Then, just for a heartbeat, I could have sworn another reflection stood behind me in the glass. A silhouette, not mine. I spun around, but the van was empty. The air was colder now, and the static was back, circling the clearing like something that knew I was trapped. The static crawled around the van like a living thing, soft at first, then tightening, twisting, folding over itself in uneven pulses. It felt less like sound and more like pressure, like the atmosphere warping just outside the metal shell. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in that clearing, not with the word back fading from the windshield and the trees watching like they'd grown hungry. I shoved the van into drive and pressed on the gas. The engine roared, but the van barely moved, its tires digging into soil that had somehow softened beneath me. I rocked it forward and back, trying to break free. The headlights flickered across the tree line, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement between the trunks. Not running, not hiding, just standing there, still, like they were waiting for a mistake. I pushed the accelerator harder. The wheels snapped free, lurching the van forward. I aimed toward the only part of the clearing that looked thin enough to push through, an area where the ferns parted slightly. Not a road, not even a trail, just a thinner patch of growth. Branches whipped against the sides of the van as I forced my way through, the sound cracking like knuckles dragging across metal. I didn't look back. The static shifted from behind me to above me. Overhead, something moved between the canopies, too smoothly, too quickly to be an animal. Every hair on my arms rose. My instincts screamed for me not to stop, not to breathe, not to think. The moment I broke into a new stretch of forest, the static cut out. Silence dropped like a sheet over everything. And that silence was worse. The forest looked wrong. Not dangerous, just unfamiliar. The trees were straighter, younger, spaced too evenly, like plantation growth. The ground dipped slightly to the left, rolling downward in a contour I didn't remember being anywhere near Rogue Valley. This wasn't where I came in, but it also wasn't where I had just been. I drove slowly, every muscle braced for the static to return. My headlights washed across a fork in the trees. Two options. Neither looked like a road. The left sloped downward into thicker brush. The right angled upward, faintly brighter, like the moonlight found it easier to reach. My hand hovered over the wheel. A soft thud landed on the roof. Not heavy, but close. I froze. The van's interior vibrated just slightly, the way it does when someone puts their hand on the metal shell from outside. Thud. This time near the back. I didn't think. I slammed the gas and turned right. Branches snapped around me, scraping the paint, but I didn't care. I needed distance. I needed direction. I needed out. But the trees thickened around me, closing like ribs around a heart, and then something else appeared. A wooden signpost. I hit the brakes hard. The van skidded to a stop on loose soil. There, planted in the ground at a crooked angle, was a weather-worn sign. Faded white paint, letters barely legible. But I knew what it used to say. Ridge Spur 28417. The same sign that had been missing earlier. The one that marked the route-bound path. It was here, miles deeper into the valley where it didn't belong. A gust of wind pushed through the trees, cold enough to make my teeth ache. The smell came with it again, wet wire, metallic and sharp. My eyes watered. That's when I noticed the bottom of the signpost. The wood wasn't sunk into the dirt. It had been placed on top of it. Moved. Recently. The soil around the base was disturbed, fresh, and there were drag marks behind it leading into the dark. Something had carried the sign here. Something that knew I would find it. Panic cracked open inside me. It flooded everything. My judgment, my breathing, my grip on the wheel. The sign felt like a message, a direction. But a direction toward what? Something creaked above me. I looked up. Hanging from a low branch was a strip of faded fabric. No, not fabric. Nylon, gray-green, the kind used in backpacks and hiking gear. A strap. I stepped out of the van without meaning to. My feet moved before my mind caught up. I reached up, tugged gently. It was wedged between the bark and the branch. When it came free, I recognized it instantly. A brand tag was stitched on the inside. Ridge Lantern Co. Evan's favorite brand. I'd seen him wear this exact strap on his pack on our last trip to the valley a year ago. The same trip he'd mentioned the weird trail loops, the same trip he'd joked about the forest rearranging itself if you walked long enough. I hadn't heard from him in months. My breath shook as I stood there beneath the branch. The forest felt tighter, leaning inward again. The air vibrated faintly like the static was building in the roots beneath my feet. I backed toward the van, clutching the strap. It felt warm, almost too warm. The van headlights flickered, once, twice, then they cut out entirely. The darkness was absolute. The static erupted, louder, closer, surrounding me, not from a single direction, but from all directions. I scrambled into the van. The moment I shut the door, the static stopped, like it couldn't penetrate the metal. My hands shook uncontrollably as I turned the key. The van tried to start, coughing, sputtering, failing. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on, come on!" I hit the steering wheel with the heel of my hand. The radio turned on by itself. Bright screen, blue glow, volume set to 0. A moment later, the static returned, this time inside the van speakers. Faint words emerged beneath the static. A voice. Deep. Broken. Layered like it was echoing through a tunnel. "You shouldn't have come back." I felt the blood drain from my face. My throat closed. The voice wasn't Evan's, but it wasn't unfamiliar. It sounded like the man from the Crater Lake video, the one who claimed the forest echoed his own voice back at him, the one whose video had vanished, the one who'd written that symbol in the dirt before the frame cut out, the same symbol I'd seen carved on the trees. I stared at the radio screen. The station number flickered, 88.1, 89.4, 93.7, no pattern, no stability. Then it froze. At 00.0, the static cut out completely. For a moment, the van was silent. Then the voice came again, not through the speakers, from behind me, back. I turned slowly, terrified of what I'd see in the darkness of the van's rear cabin. But there was nothing, no one, just the empty bed platform, my gear, the closed cabinets. The voice hadn't been inside. It had been outside, right behind the van. Something pressed gently against the rear panel, soft enough to be deliberate, firm enough to be undeniable. A touch. I floored the gas. The van lurched violently forward. Branches whipped past. My side mirror snapped against a trunk. I didn't care. I kept going until the trees thinned, until the slope dipped downward, until the static faded behind me like I was outrunning a signal range. The forest opened suddenly into a rocky stretch. I recognized the sound before I saw it. The Rogue River rushing somewhere ahead. Relief shot through me so fast it hurt. If I could find the river crossing, I could follow the service road back out. I pushed the van forward, weaving between the thinner trees until the river appeared, glinting silver in the moonlight. But the moment my headlights swept across the riverbank, my stomach dropped. There, pressed into the mud, was the same footprint. Bare, human, facing the forest, like someone had been standing there again, watching me return. Below the footprint, scrawled into the mud with a single straight line, was the circle symbol with the 3 radiating marks. Fresh, waiting. The static rose behind me like a tide rolling in. The forest whispered, branches shifting without wind. And as I stared at that fresh mark in the mud, a cold truth settled over me. Whatever was guiding me wasn't trying to chase me. It was trying to turn me around. It was trying to funnel me somewhere deeper, somewhere I didn't want to go, somewhere I wasn't meant to leave. I didn't sleep. Not really. Every time I drifted off, the image of that pale hand hanging under my water tank snapped me awake. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard footsteps dragging through the pine needles outside. By 4 a.m., I sat upright at the dinette, knife in hand, listening. The forest was too quiet. No night birds, no insects. Even the distant creek I heard yesterday felt muted, like the whole landscape was holding its breath. At 5:12 a.m., my motion sensor pinged again, one soft chime, right outside my RV door. My stomach flipped. I slowly peeked through the window. At first, nothing. Then the sensor blinked again, and I realized something horrifying. It wasn't detecting motion. It was detecting lack of motion. Something was standing so still it kept flickering in and out of the sensor's pattern. And then it stepped forward. A skinny figure, taller than any person should be, slowly drifted across the gravel. Not walking, drifting, like its feet barely touched the ground. It had the shape of a man, but the head tilted at an unnatural angle, chin nearly touching its shoulder, like the neck was broken. I stumbled back from the window, slamming into the wall. My breath hitched. A cold panic spread through my chest. Whatever it wasn't human anymore. My radio crackled on by itself. Get out! The voice was pitched wrong, like someone playing a recording backwards, syllables stretched and warped. My heart clawed at my ribs. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and yanked open the driver's door, but I froze. On the windshield, written in long wet streaks, was a message. Stop running. Not painted, not smeared, but written with a finger, dragging from the inside out. I spun around. Did it get in? Was it inside? The cupboards rattled. A low, choking sound came from beneath the sink, as if someone were gasping through a mouthful of dirt. Nope. I was done. I dove into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. I tried again. It refused to turn over. Behind me, inside the RV, something scraped along the floor. Slow, deliberate, moving toward the front. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I didn't care. I kicked open the door, jumped out, and bolted into the trees. Branches whipped my face. Rocks cut my feet through my shoes. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just ran until the sun finally bled over the horizon and the forest shifted from black to gray. When I finally collapsed near the service road, a ranger truck happened to be driving by. The ranger saw me, pale and shaking, and loaded me in. I was babbling, unable to explain anything that made sense. When we returned to my campsite hours later, the RV was normal. No writing on the windshield, no scratches on the door, no motion alerts. But the ranger crouched near my water tank, touching the gravel. "What's that?" I asked, still trembling. He held up something thin and pale, a finger bone, weathered, cracked, old. But the end was clean, freshly snapped. He bagged it. Didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I already knew. I hadn't been alone out there, and whatever had crawled under my RV, something had taken a piece of it with me. They let me stay at the ranger station until I stopped shaking. The ranger who found me, his name was Holt, sat across from me at a metal table, fingers laced, eyes scanning me like he was trying to decide if I was traumatized, lying, or telling the worst kind of truth. "You're not the first," he finally said. My breath stuttered. Holt leaned back, rubbed his eyes, and sighed. "Most people who camp alone out in that sector, they report strange things, footsteps, someone tapping on the RV, sometimes figures in the tree line." "So why don't you shut it down?" I asked. He gave a humorless smile. "And tell them what? That something old and angry still walks those woods?" I swallowed. "Whatever you saw," Holt continued, "it doesn't want the land, doesn't want to hurt people in the normal way." He paused, searching for the right words. "It wants attention, recognition, to be seen, and when it feels ignored, it follows." I thought of the pale figure drifting past my RV, the broken neck tilt, the way it scraped along my floor, the voice in the radio begging me to get out. I shivered. "Good news, though," Holt said, standing. "Most folks who leave never experience it again." I exhaled in relief. Then Holt placed something on the table between us. A small evidence bag. Inside was that finger bone, but now the clean snapped end was darkened, like something had burned it from the inside. The ranger's voice dropped low. "But you're different." My heart tightened. "Why?" Holt pointed to the bag. "Because whatever it is, it marked you, took something, left something. There's a connection now." I shook my head. "No, I left. I ran." "You did," he said gently. "But did it?" I stared at him, confused. Then I remembered the message on my windshield. Stop running. Not to stop running from it, but because running didn't matter. It was already with me. 3 days later, I drove home, slept with every light on, checked under every cabinet, every vent, every crawl space. Nothing happened. Not until the fourth night. At 2:19 a.m., my RV's motion sensor, still mounted from that trip, pinged softly from inside my garage. One chime, then another, like something moving just enough and then standing perfectly still. I crept closer to the window overlooking the garage. The sensor blinked, then blinked again, and then, just for a flicker of a second, I saw a shape through the frosted glass. Tall, bent, head cocked at a broken angle. Watching my RV, watching me. My phone buzzed on the counter. A notification. Motion detected inside, living room. I wasn't in the living room, but something was. A scraping sound echoed from the hallway, slow, deliberate, coming closer. As I backed into the corner of my kitchen, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth, I understood the truth. You don't escape things like that. You don't outrun them. You don't outpray them, outthink them, or outdistance them. Some horrors don't live in the woods. They live in the space between moments, in the breath before sleep, in the silence after darkness, in the places you run to, not from. And when one of them chooses you, it doesn't matter where you go. It only matters how long you can pretend you don't hear it, dragging itself closer. I used to believe that the deeper you travel into America's national forests, the quieter life becomes. I thought silence was peace, that solitude meant safety. But the truth is, silence can carry things, memories, warnings, even footsteps that you were never meant to hear. And the night you finally understand that is the night the forest begins speaking back. My name is Aaron Keller. I'm 49 years old, born and raised in New Mexico, and I've spent the better part of the last decade driving my RV across the United States, documenting the forgotten corners of our wilderness for anyone willing to listen. I've camped beneath redwoods so tall they pierced cloud banks, parked beside lakes so still the mountains looked painted on their surface, and slept under skies so black they swallowed the horizon whole. But for everything I've seen, it's the things I couldn't explain that stayed with me. And in the heart of America's national forests, there are stories, true stories, that don't fit neatly into maps or guidebooks. Stories people whisper only when the fire burns low and the shadows lean close. The night that changed how I look at every forest in this country started in the Cibola National Forest, deep in central New Mexico. I had chosen a remote ridge off a little-maintained service road, a spot isolated enough that my nearest human neighbor was probably 10 miles away. I've always liked solitude. Years of traveling alone will teach you to crave it the way others crave noise. But even as I pulled my RV into that clearing, even as the tires crackled over pine needles and the wind brushed against the aluminum siding, something about the place felt off. Not dangerous, just watchful. Still, I set up camp because solitude, even uncomfortable solitude, was the point. The sun was slipping behind the ridge, turning the sky into a molten copper river, and the air smelled of cooling earth and juniper sap. I remember thinking that if rest had a scent, it would smell exactly like that. But as night took hold, that feeling of rest began to change. The wind died too suddenly. The temperature dropped hard enough that my breath became visible inside the RV, and the forest, hundreds of square miles of it, went silent. Not quiet. Silent. People who spend time in the backcountry know the difference. Quiet is natural. Wind through branches, an owl shifting on its perch, the distant crash of a stream. Silence, though, silence feels wrong, like something is standing out there, waiting for you to notice it. At around 11, I stepped outside to check the leveling jacks after feeling a faint tilt in the RV floor. My breath fogged instantly across the beam of my headlamp. Everything around me was still. No rustle, no insects, no wind. Just a black wall of pines stretching outward into a darkness thick enough to feel on your skin. That was when I heard it. A low, dragging exhale from somewhere inside the tree line. Not a branch shifting, not an animal moving, but breath. Deep, slow, deliberate. The kind of breath something takes before deciding what to do with you. I froze. I know that's not what you're supposed to do, but instinct has a way of stripping away logic. My headlamp illuminated nothing but trunks and shadows. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, maybe an elk, maybe even a black bear exhaling after rooting around. But I'd spent too much time in the wild to lie to myself. No four-legged animal breathes like that. Not with intention. Not like it's studying you. I backed toward the RV, slow, careful, trying not to crack a single twig. My chest tightened with that strange, creeping awareness that my body wasn't fully under my control anymore. Every step felt heavy, deliberate, as though something inside me had already accepted I was being hunted. Then came the second sound. Not an exhale, not breath, but a mimic of one. A quiet, shaky attempt at a human whisper. Like someone trying to speak without knowing how. A broken, breathy syllable that sounded disturbingly like my name stretched into pieces. Ah! On! My legs nearly gave out. I made it into the RV and slammed the door, locking all 3 latches and shutting off the interior lights. My pulse hammered in my ears as I crouched beneath the window line, waiting for something, anything to move outside. But the woods were still again. Not alive, not natural, but still. Minutes passed. Then an hour. My mind kept replaying that breath, that voice trying to shape itself into a word. My word. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was hadn't just found me. It had been waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Every few minutes I heard faint, irregular clicking sounds from outside, like small stones tapping together or knuckles brushing bark. Sometimes it came from the left side of the RV, sometimes from the right, sometimes from directly beneath the floor. Always close, always deliberate. I'd heard stories from other travelers, strange stories, cryptid stories, but I'd always tucked them into the dusty corners of my mind, somewhere between local folklore and exaggerations born from loneliness. But that night, crouched in my dark RV, listening to something circle me in the dead silence, folklore suddenly felt like the most reasonable explanation. Around 4 a.m, I felt the RV shift again. A small, subtle tilt, like something had stepped onto the rear bumper. I held my breath. Then the metal creaked under weight, slow, heavy, intentional. I didn't look. I couldn't. I sat there sweating through my shirt despite the cold, watching the shadow of something move across the faint sliver of moonlight on the RV floor. Only a suggestion of movement. Not enough to understand its shape, just enough to know it wasn't a person. And then, nothing. The pressure lifted, the RV settled, and silence returned, thicker than before. When dawn broke, I opened the door with the cautious reverence of someone peeling back the lid of their own coffin. The air warmed quickly with sunrise, and the first birdsong of morning, normally a comfort, felt strangely out of place, like the forest was pretending to be normal again. But the ground behind the RV wasn't normal. In the soft soil near the bumper were impressions, not footprints, not paw prints. Deep, wide depressions shaped like elongated ovals, each one more than a foot long, and spaced farther apart than any stride I've ever seen in a 4-legged animal. I didn't wait to investigate. I left. Fast. Not recklessly, but with the steady, unwavering focus of someone who knows better than to test whatever mercy they were granted. But leaving Cibola wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because once you encounter something the forest was never meant to show you, the world refuses to shrink back to its old shape. Suddenly, every national forest felt different. Every shadow carried weight. Every gust of wind sounded like breath. And over the years that followed through Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, and Oregon, I learned that my story wasn't unique. Whatever I met that night was not confined to Cibola. Other travelers had heard it. Some had seen shapes between trees that bent light in the wrong direction. Some had watched silhouettes move in perfect silence where no living creature should walk. And some never came back to tell their story at all. I didn't know it then, but I was already being pulled into a pattern older than roads, older than maps, older than the forests themselves. A pattern of things that dwelled just beyond the boundary of our understanding, waiting for the moment a lone camper steps far enough away from safety to finally hear them breathe. And the next encounter, the one that confirmed everything in me, that happened in Idaho's Bitterroot National Forest, where sound carried differently, as if the trees themselves leaned in to listen to your fear. That's where the forest stopped watching me from afar. That's where it started following me. Bitterroot National Forest is the kind of place that makes you feel small even before anything strange happens. The mountains rise like dark shoulders against the sky, and the pines grow so tightly together that even daylight seems reluctant to slip between them. By the time I arrived there, months had passed since the night in Cibola. I'd convinced myself that what I'd heard in New Mexico was an isolated incident, a strange but explainable encounter, maybe with an animal I wasn't familiar with. That was the story I built, the one I tried to believe. But the truth was that I had been looking over my shoulder in every forest since, waiting for silence to drop again the way a trap resets. I thought Idaho might give me peace. I was wrong. I had set up camp beside a creek that threaded through a narrow ravine. The water's constant movement should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a distraction. Steady white noise that left too much room for other sounds to slip in unnoticed. My RV sat on a patch of level ground beneath a stand of lodgepole pines whose trunks were tall and thin, almost eerily uniform. I remember thinking they looked like prison bars. I dismissed the thought. You dismiss a lot of thoughts out there because if you let every stray discomfort grow roots, the forest will swallow you whole. I arrived just before sunset. The air smelled of riverstone and sap, but beneath that was something faintly metallic. I chalked it up to minerals in the creek, but the smell clung to the back of my throat long after I stepped inside the RV. I cooked a simple meal, watched the last warm light fade from the sky, and convinced myself that the rising unease I felt was just memory trying to sabotage the present. The human mind is skilled at fear, but it's even better at denial. The first sign that something was wrong came around 9 when the creek went quiet. Not softer, not slower, quiet. I stepped outside to look, and the water was still moving, fast even, but there was no sound, no splash, no rush, just a silent ribbon cutting through the rocks like someone had muted the world. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. Water doesn't flow without sound. That isn't how physics works. But there I was, watching the impossible. A cold ripple went through my chest, and for one terrifying second, I couldn't tell if the silence was around me or inside me. My ears rang, my breath shortened. I took a step back toward the RV, fighting the instinct to turn and run. Running blind in the forest at night is just another way to disappear. Then came the knock, soft, hollow, against a tree trunk somewhere to my right. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't rhythmic. It wasn't natural. It sounded like someone testing wood for rot. I swept my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam got swallowed by the trees. The pines were too dense and the shadows were too deep. Everything looked like everything else. Then another knock, this time behind me. My pulse jumped. I turned, light trembling in my hand. Nothing. The forest remained still and silent as if waiting for me to make the next move. The air had cooled so quickly that my breath fogged again, just like Cibola, and a thin frost began forming along the grass even though the forecast hadn't predicted freezing temperatures. Every instinct screamed at me to get inside. I stepped back toward the RV, one foot finding the aluminum step just as something new broke the silence. A whistle. Low. Human-shaped. But wrong. Like someone trying to mimic a tune they had only heard once, decades ago. Familiar yet fractured. I froze on the steps, barely breathing. Another whistle responded, from across the ravine, then a third, farther off, but somehow clearer, like it was above me. I felt the same cold, creeping awareness I had felt in New Mexico. I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't merely watching. It was coordinating. I shut the door and locked it, but the feeling of safety was thin, transparent even. The kind of safety you pretend exists because the alternative is too big to comprehend. Inside the RV, the silence grew heavy, pressing against the windows until they seemed to bow inward. Even my own footsteps felt muffled. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my flashlight still in my shaking hand, and waited. Time stretched impossibly thin. It could have been minutes or hours before the next sound came. A faint scrape along the lower exterior panel of the RV, metal against something hard. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. The sound traveled slowly toward the rear bumper, as if something were dragging the back of its hand along the aluminum siding, feeling the shape of the vehicle. My throat tightened. I turned off the flashlight so nothing inside would shine through the windows. The scraping stopped. Then something pressed against the rear of the RV. A single, heavy thud, soft enough not to damage anything, hard enough to let me know it was real. I held my breath again. The air inside the RV was cold enough that condensation formed along the edges of the cabinets. My exhale puffed out like smoke, swirling in front of me in the faint glow of the moonlight leaking through the blackout curtains. Then I heard the whistle again. This time, it wasn't outside. It was beneath the RV, directly below me. A long, low tune that vibrated up through the floor and into my ribs. Something was under the vehicle, lying in the gravel, inches from where I sat. I felt it move, felt the faint shift in weight on the suspension, felt the rhythm of the whistle as it changed into a slow, drawn-out exhale. Just like the breath in Cibola, just like the voice that had almost formed my name. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. I wanted to scream, but the silence felt too thick to break, so I sat there shaking, listening to something beneath me breathe as though it were memorizing the sound of my heartbeat. Then everything stopped again. No breath, no whistle, no scrape, no movement. Just the silent forest, the still creek, and the cold pressing in. I stayed awake until dawn, knees locked, eyes wide, staring at the floor like I could somehow see the thing beneath me. And when sunlight finally seeped through the curtains, I hesitated before opening the door. Part of me feared something would be waiting. Another part feared nothing would be there at all, that absence would be worse because it meant whatever had visited me could disappear whenever it wanted. But I opened the door anyway. The creek's sound had returned, rushing loud and natural. Birds were calling, the air was warming, and yet the ground told the truth. The gravel beneath the RV was disturbed, not in the scattered pattern of an animal. No paw prints, no footprints, just two parallel grooves dragged slowly in a circle around the vehicle, as though something long-bodied and heavy had slid around me all night, listening. I left Bitterroot with that same sickening feeling from Cibola, like someone had looked through me rather than at me. And I realized then that this wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a unique haunting, or a one-time encounter with something the forest coughed up. This was a pattern. These were the unseen, the watchers, the mimics. And the deeper I traveled into America's national forests, the more their presence followed me. What I didn't know, not yet, was that my next encounter would bring me face to face with something that didn't just watch or listen. It wanted to be understood. It wanted to speak. And it chose the Olympic Peninsula to try. The Olympic Peninsula has always felt different from the other forests I've traveled through. Older, somehow. Wilder in a way that isn't about danger, but about memory. Like the moss-draped branches have witnessed things humans were never meant to see. Everything in that region feels alive, but not in the welcoming sense. More like a pulse beneath the soil, slow and deliberate, beating to some rhythm that began long before human feet touched those trails. By the time I arrived there, the weight of what had followed me from Cibola to Bitterroot had settled into my bones. I didn't speak about it with anyone, not because I feared judgment, but because speaking it aloud felt like acknowledging something that might hear me and respond. The forest listens. I learned that the hard way. I chose a spot near the Hoh rainforest, remote, dense, wrapped in layers of moss so thick they turned trees into towering, breathing sculptures. The ground squished underfoot with the constant damp. Every sound felt softened, swallowed, diffused into the green. It was early fall, and the air was cool enough that my breath drifted faintly ahead of me. The sky was a low ceiling of gray, promising rain. I parked my RV off an unmarked pullout, a place recommended to me by an old ranger I met in Forks. He told me it was quiet country, tucked away from the typical foot traffic. I remember thinking that quiet was the very last thing I was looking for, yet I drove there anyway. Fear has a strange way of pulling you back toward the places you least want to return to. Maybe I thought confronting the quiet meant reclaiming something inside myself. As evening settled, the forest shifted. The usual sounds, distant birds, the soft patter of water dripping from leaf to leaf, grew faint. The air thickened, and I felt it again, the sensation I'd tried so hard to outrun, something watching from the edges of the trees. I tried distracting myself, made coffee, checked my maps, wrote notes from the road, but by the time the sky went fully dark, unease had crept into every corner of the RV. There was no silence yet, no unnatural stillness, just a steady, rising tension in my chest, the kind that tells you the story isn't finished. At around 10, I stepped outside to breathe in the cool night air. A low mist had begun to form, drifting between the trunks like pale cloth. The smell of wet earth and cedar grew sharp. The forest felt impossibly still, but not quiet, just paused like it was waiting to see what I would do. That was when I heard it. Not a breath, not a whisper, not a knock, but a voice. Clear. Human. Calling out from somewhere deeper in the woods. Hello? I froze in place. Every nerve in my body pulled tight. It was a man's voice. Mid-40s maybe. Calm but uncertain. The kind of voice someone uses when they're lost but not yet afraid. Is someone out there? I didn't move, didn't answer, because something was wrong, horribly wrong. The voice wasn't coming from one direction. It echoed from 3 different points in the trees, slight variations in distance, slight differences in pitch, but the same voice. Repeating. Layered. Practiced. A mimic. My chest tightened as fear crawled up my spine. The mist moved strangely at the edges of my vision, rising where nothing warm should exist, spreading around trunks where no wind stirred. Then the voice called again, this time from only one direction. Closer. Hey, I could use a little help here. The words were perfect. Too perfect. No stagger, no fatigue, no wind affecting the sound. Just a clean, human tone stretching through a forest that had gone absolutely still. For a second, some part of me wanted to believe it. Wanted to step toward the voice instead of away. That was how these things worked. They pried open the cracks inside you, the part that still wants to help a stranger, even when logic claws at your throat. The mist thickened, curling around my boots. Something moved within it. Nothing visible, nothing fully formed, just a shift. Like weight pressing down on the earth from something tall. My instincts screamed. I stepped backward, one slow inch at a time, until my hand found the RV door handle. I didn't slam it shut. I eased it closed, hands trembling, eyes never leaving the place where the voice had come from. Inside, I moved in the dark, refusing to turn on a single light. My breath was shallow. My pulse hammered in my neck. And then, from outside, the man's voice called again. Hey, why'd you leave? The words were right outside the RV, right outside the window, too close to be possible in the time since it last spoke. I clamped a hand over my mouth, then came a second voice, identical, same man, same tone, but younger. Come on, help me, followed by a third, raspier. You saw me, didn't you? 3 voices. Same man, speaking from different distances, different angles, different ages. My vision blurred with panic. I sank to the floor, knees pulled tight, praying the RV didn't creak, didn't move, didn't give me away. The voices continued overlapping, echoing through the trees like some twisted chorus. Then all at once they stopped. Silence rolled in like a wave, heavy, suffocating. And in that silence, something brushed the side of the RV, not scraping, not tapping, a hand, flat, slow, dragging across the metal like it was learning the shape of me again. I didn't breathe. Then 3 knocks, soft, measured, knock, 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 a perfect imitation of human rhythm, a perfect reminder of Bitterroot. The RV shifted slightly as if something placed weight against it, listening for movement inside. My heart pounded so loudly I swore it echoed through the floor. Sweat chilled down my back. Every second felt stretched thin, fragile. Then the voice spoke again. Only one now. But this time, it used my name. Aaron, barely above a whisper. A slow exhale woven into the letters. Like a sigh trying to become language. My stomach twisted. I hadn't told anyone my name since arriving in Washington. I hadn't spoken to a soul after that Ranger days earlier, and yet that voice outside, whatever wore it, spoke my name through the mist. I closed my eyes. My hands shook so hard I could feel the vibration echo through my legs. For a moment, I thought the next thing I heard would be the RV door handle turning. But instead, something stepped away. Just a single, heavy stride. Then another. The mist shifted, parting around an unseen form. Then everything, sound, presence, weight, faded, as if whatever was out there had decided something, as if it had learned enough. I didn't fall asleep, not even after daylight returned and the forest pretended to be alive again. When I finally stepped outside, the damp ground was marked where something had stood. Huge impressions, long and narrow, not matching any wildlife in the region. But near the RV doorframe, in the condensation on the metal, was something far worse. A partial handprint, 4 long fingers, no thumb, pressed impossibly far apart, as if the hand had wrapped around the door. Olympic National Forest didn't just observe me, it reached for me. And it spoke. I left Washington that same day, but something left with me, an understanding, a certainty. These things move through the national forests the way wind moves through mountains. Not bound to place, not bound to form, and the people who claim to have seen them, they're not mistaken, they're not confused, they're not lying, they're survivors. Because whatever these cryptids are, whatever intelligence they carry, whatever hunger or curiosity drives them, they are watching us. And some of us, like me, have looked back. People ask why I keep traveling after everything I've seen. Why I still camp in national forests when those forests have whispered, breathed, and pressed their weight against the walls of my RV. Why I keep going back to the places that bent the edges of reality and left marks in the soil no animal should be able to leave. The answer is simple, though it took years for me to admit it out loud. I'm not running from these encounters. I'm trying to understand them. Because somewhere between the fear and the silence, between the mimicry and the impossible footprints, a truth has taken shape, slowly, like a face forming behind frosted glass. A truth that's deeper than campfire legends, older than the national forests themselves, and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined when I first set out across the country in my RV. These things, the unseen, as I've come to call them, aren't accidents of evolution. They're not random mutations or undiscovered species wandering alone in the dark. They're intelligent, coordinated, territorial in a way that goes far beyond instinct. But most of all, they're curious. Curious about us. And the more remote the forest, the more isolated the campsite, the closer they move toward the light of the fire, toward the hum of the RV. Toward the heartbeat of the lone traveler who believes the night is empty. I learned this last piece the hardest way possible, on a quiet stretch of forest road cutting through northern Colorado, where the pines stood tall enough to carve shadows into the sky. It was late October, the air crisp, the nights long. I'd parked on a narrow turnout overlooking a steep slope that fell into a valley of tangled underbrush. The forest here felt more open than the peninsula, more spacious than Bitterroot, but there was something else in the air, a subtle electricity that made the hair on my arms rise. I told myself it was altitude, cold, imagination. You can excuse anything if you try hard enough. The first unusual thing I noticed was the smell. Not rot, not decay. Something like wet stone mixed with static electricity. The faint ozone scent you get right before lightning touches the ground. It drifted across the clearing in waves, stronger one moment, fading the next. I opened the RV windows to air the place out, but that only let more of it in. By dusk, the smell was everywhere. By nightfall, the forest went quiet again. It wasn't the absolute suffocating silence like Cibola, with the wind dying all at once. This was different. More methodical, as if each sound around me was being removed one by one. First the insects, then the birds, then the far-off rustle of animals moving through the brush, until the only sound left was the faint ticking of the RV cooling in the night. Tick, tick, tick. Then that stopped too. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and felt the cold hit me like a wall. The pines towered overhead, perfectly still. The moon hung low, a dim silver disk hazed by thin clouds. I took one step forward, then another, listening for anything that would confirm I wasn't alone. The sound that answered me wasn't one I had ever heard before. It wasn't a breath, it wasn't a knock, it wasn't a whistle. It was a tremor, a deep, resonant vibration rising through the ground like something massive shifting far beneath the forest floor. The dirt under my boots quivered, not violently, but rhythmically, like a slow, heavy heartbeat pushing through the earth itself. I crouched down, placed my palm on the soil, and felt it again. Thump. Pause. Thump. Not seismic. Not mechanical. Alive. My mouth went dry. I backed toward the RV, flashlight flickering in my trembling hand. The vibration grew stronger, then weaker, then stronger again, like whatever was moving was drawing closer, then pausing, then adjusting its path. When it stopped completely, the forest went impossibly still. A moment later, something exhaled behind me. A long, slow breath that brushed the back of my neck like wind through a keyhole. I spun so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. My beam cut through the trees, slicing the darkness into narrow columns of pale light. Nothing. No animal, no person, no shape between the trunks. But the smell of ozone grew sharp, overpowering, electric, almost metallic on my tongue. I stepped backward again, the fear in my chest blooming outward like cold fire. That was when the voice came. Not the voice from Washington, not the layered mimicry. This voice was low, resonant, almost subterranean, a vibration formed into rough sound, like a boulder learning how to speak. It said a single word. Not my name, not a human word at all. But I understood the meaning. It meant here. Not a greeting, a statement. It wasn't asking if I was here. It was telling me it was. My knees weakened. I stumbled back onto the RV steps, heart slamming so hard I could taste blood. The air thickened with cold, and a thin thread of fog began to curl around my boots, rising as though pulled upward by invisible hands. Then the trees shifted, not from wind, from weight. Something enormous moved through them, silent, deliberate, bending trunks without snapping them. Shadows warped. Space changed shape. My flashlight sputtered, then steadied, and for a fraction of a second the beam caught something between the trees. Not a body. Not a creature. Just an outline, a distortion in the air itself, tall enough that the beam hit its midsection, and 5 long vertical ridges where a ribcage might be, faintly visible, faintly glowing, as though absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. Then it vanished, not by moving, by ceasing. The forest exhaled, not air, space itself shifting back into place. I slammed the RV door and locked it, backing into the small darkness where walls meant nothing but still felt like the only protection I had. My breath trembled, my hands shook. Every instinct urged me to drive, to flee, to get as many miles between myself and that valley as possible. But I didn't move, because in that moment, drowning in fear, heart hammering against my ribs, I realized something. This wasn't just pursuit. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. These things, the unseen, were letting me witness them. Letting me survive, letting me learn. Because for all the terror they bring, for all the nights they mimic our voices or breathe against our windows or hide in the seams of the trees, they could take us whenever they wanted. The truth isn't that they're hunting us. The truth is far worse. They're studying us. And the national forests of America, the vast wild places we cherish for their solitude, are their sanctuary, their territory. They're silent observatories where they watch the wanderers who dare to believe they're alone. I left Colorado the moment dawn broke, but something in me changed that night. For the first time, the fear didn't hollow me out. It focused me. Because understanding the darkness doesn't make it disappear, but it gives you a fighting chance to meet it with open eyes. And if you camp long enough, brave enough, far enough from the safety of crowds and campgrounds, you'll feel it too, the moment the forest shifts, the moment something unseen steps closer. The moment you realize you're not just witnessing the wilderness is witnessing you. And whether you run, stand still, or pretend you don't hear your name whispered between the trees, one truth remains. These forests are alive with more than wind, more than wildlife, more than the stories we pass around the fire. They hold beings older than any trail, smarter than any predator, and closer, far closer than you think. So the next time you pull your RV into a quiet clearing, shut off the engine, and settle into the comforting hum of isolation, listen. Listen very carefully, because if the forest ever goes silent, truly silent, you're no longer alone, and whatever is standing just beyond the glow of your campfire has been waiting for you.